And we're live. And now the mythless man stands eternally hungry, surrounded by all past ages, and digs and grubs for roots, even if he has to dig for them among the remotest antiquities. Friedrich Nietzsche. And this is On Tyranny, the radio branch of Ancient Greece Revisited. We apologize for the long hiatus of publishing another episode, but here we are, back live and kicking, although Ancient Greece Revisited never stopped running. We've been producing great episodes in our YouTube channel, which you are all invited to watch. The topic of today is something that we've touched lightly upon on Tyranny and many times in Ancient Greece Revisited, and it's the Indo-European culture, faith, language, and spirituality. And for that, in one of our episodes, I was suggested that I need to speak with someone who knows much more than me on this subject. And here we have them in the show. Cohen Aris Rollinson, hailing from New Zealand. How are you, sir?
Very good. Yourself?
Very, very good. I'm very good amidst all the madness, I might say. The topic of Indo-European culture is a very, very polarizing one. One would think it's a straightforward subject for academics, but no. And we've been receiving pushes and pulls from both sides, you know. We had a great discussion with Tom Rouso from Survive the Jive. Again, a very good episode, I think. I salute him wherever Tom is and thank him again. But we had our typical comments. I'm just going to read one comment. I'd like to start heavy hitting. So our last episode in Ancient Greece Revisited is called The Ring of Nestor. It explores a side of, I guess, Minoan is the going title, Minoan civilization, and what Arthur Evans thought about it, and perhaps even projected onto that talisman, onto that ring. And we're talking about Indo-European cultures and Minoan cultures and how they blended and how they conquered. And I had a comment which reads as follows. Couldn't watch after the first minute or so. I can't take seriously anyone who mentions the made-up term Indo-European, a term that was developed by an amateur with zero mention in ancient sources, zero geological or other reasons of such a population move, unlike the theories about Pelasgi, I guess she also means Minoans, which would easily, along with Hellenic kingdoms in India, explain the similarities in some linguistic routes. What do we answer to that, sir?
Well, it's rather unfortunate that you seem to get such comments. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation about these sorts of subjects, and a lot of it is motivated by various things other than what we might call the truth. Now, to take the bull by the horns, as it were, which I assume is a very appropriate thing for some Minoans to do, of course the term Indo-European...
For someone looking into Minoans...
Of course the term Indo-European is not an ancient one. It's in modern English. I don't know why you'd expect it to be illegitimate as a result of this. I mean, we can talk about, say, modern Greeks. We use the word Greek. This does not mean there weren't a Hellenic people. We can use the word Indian. This doesn't mean there weren't Indo-Aryans, of course, by a different name 3,000 years ago. It's a very strange objection to have. In terms of the actual science... the facts are quite clear. Now, the lead study, when we get into the archaeogenetics of this, I believe it's still the Narasimhan one that came out into 2019, it charts quite directly the course of migration which took Indo-European peoples in several directions. That study's focus is on the eastward migration, which eventually winds up in India. Other studies have, in the past, quite rigorously demonstrated very similar patterns hailing from the Proto-Indo-European Urhima, the original homeland, which appears to be on the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, heading to the south, which of course winds up eventually with Greece, etc., heading to the west, the Western European sort of Celtic expansions eventually, and of course into the north, where some interesting things happen with regard to some of our own ancestors in the Nordic sphere. Now, the point which we must make about this is that a lot of the people who are... I've seen some of the comments which your channel brings in whenever this comes up. I understand to a certain extent where they're coming from. Because we're socialized to think as soon as we hear words like Aryan, or as soon as we hear these discussions of heritage, that swastikas are fluttering in the background. And I don't mean in the Hindu sense, I mean in the sort of the 1930s Germany sense. It is very unfortunate that this has occurred, and I don't mean to deny the history around that for a second, but the trouble is, they assume, these people who object to Indo-European, well, theory you might sort of call it, upon such a basis, that any discussion is irrevocably tainted by this. This is a most unfortunate attitude to have. The facts are the facts. Now, these facts can be misused, I don't dispute that for a moment. The reason why we do what we do is to try and ensure the opposite, that they're actually used for an appropriate purpose, illuminating and exploring the past and anchoring us securely in our heritage, knowing our roots, so that we know where we come from, and therefore where we may be going. I believe that harkens back to that Nietzsche quotes that I've just aforementioned. So in terms of the Indo-European project, if you like, this ability to explore the heritage involved, we don't see it as a divisive thing. We're not here looking for blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan Superman of sort of a Germanic pedigree. Quite the opposite. We're here looking for the shared bonds of sodality which unite people all the way from India to Iceland in these commonalities, this common ancestry, this common heritage. It's the opposite of what these people are possibly understandably, or possibly less so, objecting to. Now, of course, in terms of, I suppose you might say, why I'm interested in all of this, the genetics are interesting. They're not my interest in particular, but they are academically interesting. They can be used for useful purposes. The linguistics are also interesting, and I must confess that even though I'm no linguist, I'm a humble theologian who happens to use linguistics, I do find them quite, very cool to sort of look through. But my major purpose with regard to all of that is quite different, although it draws from the linguistic sphere in particular. My purpose is the theological one. That is to say, the resurrection, the reincarnation, if you will, of Indo-European religion across the world. Now, in my own personal practice, my own personal sort of backstory, I am a Hindu. Now, it's, of course, I'm a rather pale Hindu. Gora would be the technical term. I have Indo-Nepali adoptive family, so I took up the ancestral ways of that particular clade as a result of a long, complex backstory we probably don't have time to go into here. But the point is, it led me to the last living Indo-European religion, even though I didn't really think of it in those terms at the time. It wasn't until some time in that one day I was at temple, well, mandala would be the technical term, my temple, and I basically got told to do something. If you, we'll basically sort of approach that as sort of a factual statement. I was sitting in front of the Durga Murti. Basically, Durga in sort of Hellenic terms would be cognate with Athena, we might sort of say, but also Hera at the same time. It's an interesting sort of combination. But I basically got told to do what we do, to re-illuminate the shared bonds of sodality and heritage between the Indo-European peoples as part of remaking the world in her image. Which is to say, getting Indo-European peoples thinking of themselves appropriately as her children, and being able to worship and honour their parents, the gods in this particular regard, in an appropriate manner as a result. Now, the fact of the matter is that outside the Hindu sphere, Indo-European religion has been in retreat for somewhere between 1,000, 2,000, or even further years, depending upon where you are. The last vestiges of Indo-European religion as a lived thing in Western Europe died out with the Northern Crusades about 500, well, actually longer than that, but that's folkways, but about a little less than a millennium ago when it comes to the Baltic states. The Christianization
when the Nordic faiths were conquered by Christianity, you mean?
Yes, well, this is actually slightly later than that, because the Baltic sphere is close to the Nordic sphere, but it's subtly different in some rather important ways. But yes, it was about some centuries after the major wave of Christianization of the Nordic sphere which had taken place, but definitely part of the same historical movement. Now, of course, what happened some centuries before that, of course, is the Hellenic sphere wound up being taken over in a similar sort of fashion, and of course the Romans in quite a similar sort of way. It's actually one of those things that I often wind up reflecting upon. We have a prominent point of theology in the Hindu sphere around Vach Devi, the goddess of speech, Vach, of course, being cognate with voice, vox, those sorts of terms, being the mightiest war goddess, the mightiest weapon, in fact. Now, if we think about it, the Jews at the Masada were resisting the Roman Empire, and it did not go very well for them. It was a glorious last stand, one of those famous things from history. But they couldn't resist the Roman Empire by that. However, one guy in particular, a guy by the name of Jesus, or other terms in other languages, Sermon on the Mount, within a few centuries, the Roman Empire was no longer the Roman Empire, religiously speaking. it had now become something entirely different. The thing that the Jews, the Masada, were sort of objecting to, amongst other things, the imposition of foreign gods and things, was no longer a threat to them, precisely because those foreign gods had been sort of cast upon the ash heap, even notwithstanding the sort of last stand efforts of Julian the Apostate and things like that. So, in terms of where this links into what I try and do through Arya Akasha, our research institute, we are trying to, as I say, resurrect, reincarnate the Indo-European religions of the West. Because the Hindu sphere, it's great, it's thriving. It's got more than 1 billion people. It's an active religion. It's an integral religion to that civilizational sphere. It's a wonderful thing. Piety is not something which is, once every few weeks or just a Sunday occasion. It's a living faith. But in terms of what's needed for this, in the Western sphere, it's not enough to just have the mythology. Now, the mythology is great. The mythology is wondrous. As a brief sort of side tangent, my parents are English teachers, amongst other things. The Reverend Rawlinson, my father, is also a Christian clergyman, but that is another matter for another time. But my mother is, as I say, English literature teacher, and one of the things which she always would be teaching her students in high school English, intermediate English, etc., was mythology. And what she'd be doing to teach this was, in particular, a version of the Odyssey, slightly sanitized for an audience of 11-year-olds, of course, but nonetheless, it meant that when I was growing up, all the other kids around me, their heroes, the people to be talking about, were superheroes, Superman, Batman, things like that. My hero, by contrast, was Odysseus. So this obviously set a bit of a lifelong passion in that particular regard. But in terms of the mythology, it's not active, it's not operationalized. We can find stuff that helps to guide us in our pious activities from the mythology. So, for example, there's a particular quote we often draw from, where I think it's Hector in the Iliad, but he's talking about how he won't make offerings to the son of Kronos, i.e. Zeus, with bloodied hands. He's going to wash his hands before he actually carries out offerings. It's a quote from Homer. So you can draw out these small elements, these skerricks, if you will, to reconstruct an operationalized faith from the mythology. We also have various theological texts. Hesiod is great in this particular regard. So, the Works and Days, the Theogony is obviously a great example as well. And of course, Pindar's Odes, the Homeric corpus of hymnals, the Orphic corpus, which needs to get much more of a look in than it often does. We can draw these liturgical elements out and go, yes, we have these cool things to chant when we're seeking to engage with the gods. But when it comes to the active stuff that is required for living piety in terms of what do we offer, how do we offer, and other things like that, we have all these gaps. Now, the Hellenic sphere is actually in I suppose you could say it's the best off of a rather unfortunate bunch in terms of how things have fallen by the wayside. When you look at the Nordic sphere, it's much worse, because we have a lot of very, very cool, beautiful poetry, which has come down to us from, of course, the skalds who'd written the stuff down, and, of course, Snorri Sturluson, who'd, a few decades after Christianization, made a desperate last-stand attempt to get as much of the stuff that he could written down, get some stuff past the radar, if you will, of the Christian authorities of the day, so censoring bits and pieces and editorializing some other bits and pieces as he went. But in terms of the active stuff that enables us to understand how the theology works as an active concern, we really don't have very much, and a lot of what we do have is subject to a lot of conjecture as to whether it's Sturluson misunderstanding things or editorializing.
Yes, and this brings us to a very interesting subject that I spoke about in one of my interviews when I was interviewed a long time ago now, talking about myth. My impression has always been this when it comes to myth, that myth is a secondary form to ritual. In other words, and perhaps even ritual is secondary form to experience. The way I've come to understand, let's say, pagan religiosity, pagan practice, is that it all starts with an experience. It all starts with some kind of revelation, where the world cracks open for a moment to the poet or to the special person that can listen to it. The music of the spheres, the love that moves the sun and other stars gets revealed, and that moment, it's only a single one. It gets captured by that person in verse, in movement, in dance, in poetry, as a mimesis, as an imitation of that moment. And then perhaps the whole tribe is invited in to just go through the motions of that first moment, which I guess is why so many of these rituals have to do with the beginnings of the world. These are not necessarily beginnings in the chronological sense, in the linear historical sense. The beginning is ever present and it gets revealed into these moments. But then myth and ritual, and then a tertiary form is exactly what you said. When these movements, chants, poetry, music, it gets written down into a story, it gets unfolded, almost like a dream where the original dream might last, like 3 seconds. But when you tell the story, it takes 20 minutes because you were somewhere with someone, and then a car passed and you jumped in and someone died. It's how our minds unfold single compact moments, fractal moments in time. And you believe there's a possibility to go the other way from these unfoldments, which is the myths that have come. Do you believe, it's a rhetorical question because I think that's exactly what you're trying to, do you believe that we can kind of fold it back and reach that experience that started it all?
Yeah, I mean, let me put it this way. In terms of what you're talking about, I would have actually reasoned it the other way, but whether we're going or coming, we wind up at the same place. It's a curious thing because, of course, as you noted, mythic time is eternal and supernal. But in terms of Eliade, now, we discussed this in the sort of the pre-call sort of warm-up thing. Eliade, for those out there in the audience who might not be aware of him, is a fantastic, well, I suppose you could call him a mythologist rather than a theologian. He was a man desperate to have a religious experience. Now, as far as I know...
Just for people who might think that Eliade just came in unwarranted the conversation, he's exactly the person that I had in mind when I just said that. So you kind of read it out of the air. So yes, please.
Well, as I say, great minds think alike, dirty minds collaborate. But in terms of Eliade, that situation of him wanting to have a religious experience, a mythic experience, meant that he went out and tried very hard to do this. And when he couldn't, he basically constructed these wonderful typologies to analyze religious and mythic experience. So I suppose he'd know if he was having one if he did, but which then enables us over here on the religious side of things to be very, adroit when it comes to analyzing exactly what you're talking about with the eternal. And the sort of the eternal return, as he called it, the mythic return, the mythic resonance. Now, the basic run-through of how that works in tangible terms is a lot of ritual behavior is re-immanentizing out into the world around us things that have occurred in mythic time, that mythic template, to uphold, if you will, the benefits which accrue therefrom. Now, a classic example of this, which does illustrate the point which I was sort of earlier hearkening towards about reconstruction, is the delivery of the empowering elixir. Now, by empowering elixir, I'll run through some brief cognates so we can see what we're talking about here. We'll start out with the obvious one, soma. Many people have heard of soma. The effective etymological meaning for it is that which is pressed. In the Nordic sphere, we have kvasser. Kvasser, once again, that which is pressed. Now, soma is to a certain extent...
These are substances, yeah. Just for people listening, these are substances that are found in various sacred texts of the Indo-European tradition.
Yep, they're generally a brew, you generally drink it, it has some interesting effects. In terms of a cognate in the Hellenic sphere, you actually have two. Soma is, relatively speaking, it's broadly cognate. There are some occasions where it isn't quite, but mostly it is, with what's known as amrit. As brief sort of linguistics, as of course means in Greek, is the opposite of mrt, like mort, mrtu, of course, murder, means death. So mrt, opposite of death, the elixir of immortality and empowerment. It's the life and strength and that sort of wonderful thing. Now, in terms of the Greek side of things, we encounter two forms that are directly cognate to one linguistically, one functionally. Ambrosia. Now, for some strange reason, the R bit is exactly the same, but ambrosia, a B particle got added in there. So if you take out the B, you wind up with morosia or something. Effectively, ambrosia is once again immortality, amrit, once again. Nectar, it's slightly more complex there because the nec particle, like necromancy and things like that, meaning, of course, dead, the tar bit means to carry through. So nectar is the thing that carries you through death. It's once again an empowering, a strengthening elixir. Now, we find this brew, this empowering enhancing elixir, mentioned in the Vedic context in a particular way, frequently, which is that it is given to the striker/thunderer deific or other mighty heroes in order to carry out some mighty deed upon the battlefield. or upon some other contexts to enable the rishis, the seers, the poets, to be able to carry out those, as you put it earlier, those sort of divine revelationary experiences. So there's an entheogenic element as well as a combat stimulant element. Although, as I once phrased it to an associate when we were talking about this and the possible role of psilocybin mushrooms in it, if I want to go dragon slaying, I better be able to see the dragons. In any case, with regard to the, I suppose you might say the...
Yeah, and interestingly enough, perhaps not many people who have not studied these know the soma is everywhere in the Vedas. It's not just this one reference that you have to really look for, and it's mentioned once, and we're making a big deal out of it. It's everywhere in a lot of the burial rituals, the Rigveda in the 10th book. There's all soma is mentioned a lot as an offering to the gods, at least, and like you said, it's an inspiration to the poet. It's not a marginal thing. It's there. It's weaved into the whole religion, it seems.
Definitely, exactly. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about these sorts of things is because we have those prominent attestations over here in the Vedic sphere, it suddenly makes sense of these somewhat more fragmentary mentions we have in the Hellenic sphere or the Nordic sphere. To take one particular example, we'll sort of address these out of the order I had in my head, which is a wonderful thing to do. In the Iliad, one thing which happens immediately before Achilles sort of does his really epic, sort of the apex of his story, his myth, if you will, is Athena turns up bearing ambrosia and nectar, and she gives it to him to enable his immense battle rage that sort of holds up almost the entire Trojan army single-handedly. So, Athena brings this particular brew, gives it to the hero attains this this magical state, this almost berserk fury. Athena, as we mentioned earlier, is broadly cognate with Vachdevi. Vachdevi is the essential goddess for the empowerment and the bestowal of the soma in various of these Vedic ritual concepts. It matches up. Now, in terms of the Nordic sphere, and where I was sort of initially intending to head with this, what we have in the Nordic sphere when it comes to the mead of poetry, Kvasara, is we have this mythological tale which is preserved in two texts in fragmentary form, the Havamal, the sayings of the Higher One, i.e. Odin, and the Skaldskaparmal, which is basically a poetic interpretation manual. Sturluson recorded a whole bunch of these poetic kennings or metaphors so they wouldn't die out because people had forgotten what they meant, which is a wonderful thing for him to do. And of course in them he has the foundational thing for the poet's craft, this thing which empowers the poet to do some rather cool stuff. Now, what happens in the Skaldskaparmal text in particular is Odin goes after this Kvasara brew, and the place he finds it is in a place called the Hnitbjorg, which Bjorg, berg, those sorts of things. It means rocks, mountains, sort of stone, Hnit, clashing, so effectively it's between two sort of rocks which clash together, which is often inferred by people taking it as a myth, that it's a mountain that opens and closes, and okay, in the mythic sense it might be. However, what I take it as is pressed stones, because in the Vedas, when you're pressing out that which is pressed, soma, kvasar, these, the trunks of the branches, you might say, of the soma plant to get the juice out, you use pressed stones. So, as we can see, between the Hnitbjorg, you find the empowering elixir. Exactly the same as in the Vedic sphere, it's just in the Vedic sphere we also have this ritual understanding that's been lost over here in the Nordic sphere. Now, to take it to the next stage of it, after Odin has attained the, in order to attain it, he must romance a particular goddess figure, Gunlot. Gunlot effectively means invitation to battle. It's quite cognate with, Upasad, some other bits and pieces. We'll get into it some other time, perhaps. But the point is, after he's romanced this particular goddess, once again, rather like Vach in this particular regard, he brings it out to the, the rest of the world in the form of a great eagle. A raptor, we might sort of say. Now, the Skyfather deific in Indo-European terms, that of course being Odin, Zeus Petara literally translates, of course, as Skyfather. Deus Petara in Sanskrit, Skyfather. Jupiter, once again, Skyfather deific, so on and so forth. The Skyfather deific brings, in raptor form, this particular empowering elixir. So Odin in eagle form brings it. In the Vedic sphere, we have Agni, which is another form of Rudra in these particular contexts, carrying out exactly the same thing in a raptor form known as Shayana, which becomes operationalized in a famous rite known as the Agni Kayana, where there is a Shayana form to the altar, whereby the altar is constructed very complexly in the shape of a falcon, which is then sort of, parts of it are set on fire, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So, what we have is a mythic template in the Nordic sphere that corresponds exactly in a bunch of very important particulars with the ritual template and mythic template, because they're both are the same. In the Vedic sphere, we find both sort of co-occurring. In order to therefore resurrect what's going on in the Nordic sphere, we therefore need to basically take what we see in the Hindu sphere and use it as a template and use it as a guide to fill out the stuff that we can only barely glimpse when it comes to the mythic preservation over there in the Nordic end of things. Now, to bring things to the, I suppose you might say the, well, another good example, which addresses this sort of this Eliadian typology, if you will, concerns that other application of the Soma to the striker/thunderer deific, i.e. Indra, i.e. Thor, i.e. in the Hellenic sphere, of course, Hercules, who winds up going off to do some dragon slaying. There's often a multi-headed dragon, occasionally it's single-headed, but the point is he winds up having to kill one. Now, in the the Vedic sphere, we have quite a number of hymnals in which this deed is accomplished. The way in which this deed is accomplished varies depending upon which hymnal we're actually sort of addressing, because different elements of this eternal sort of deed, this mythic deed, are emphasized for particular purposes depending upon what we're trying to do out here in the sort of the sidereal, the material sphere. So, in terms of grasping the fact that we have myth over here as these sort of eternal and narrative tellings of events, is not quite enough to be able to say we must have a ritual way to monetize this out into the world. What we need to do is go further and be able to say we need to have the right part of this myth in order to monetize that particular benefit and accomplish that particular thing out here inside real reality. Now, in order to sort of briefly illustrate an example of how this can sort of, one example of how this myth can become sort of operationalized and how things can be lost. The most famous telling of the Hydra slaying by Hercules. Who kills the Hydra? Well, that was a question. Who kills the Hydra?
Oh, sorry. The Hydra is killed by, you called me up, Perseus. No, Perseus kills the Medusa. Bellerophon kills the Chimera. The Hydra is killed, I think, by Hercules.
Well, that's the thing. In various of the texts which we have, yes, this does appear to be the case. However, the dominant narrative is actually a bit different. It's also the oldest, according to Hesiod's Theogony, actually killed by Aeolus, which is Hercules' charioteer, which is why it doesn't count as one of the sort of the 10 labours. Now, the other detail about that particular slaying, the reason why he's killed by Aeolus rather than Hercules is because Hercules storms in with the brute force approach and goes, we're going to decapitate the problem, it's going to be all good, nice, easy. Brute force, of course, often leads to brute stupidity. Athena, by contrast, appears to the hero pair and says, guys, you really probably should use this more sort of intellectual solution of applying fire, cauterizing the wounds which are inflicted by Hercules so the heads can't grow back. As I say, it's not the only version of it, it's just the version that sort of has become quite prominent because it's got a nice twist to it, if you will. Now, the Vedic sphere, as I say, it has a bunch of different tellings of this particular sort of myth theme. The one which I wish to emphasize is Rigveda Mandala 8, hymnal 100, yes, that's the particular hymnal, whereby what happens is quite similar. What you have is Vachdevi appears to Indra and basically goes, okay, so you want to go slay this demon dragon, Vritra. Now, you can't really do it by the direct approach. I'm going to have to help you. Now, we put that together with the other elements from various of the other tellings of it, whereby this figure called Trita Aptiya, who is this close companion of Indra, a priest figure, by the way, he has a weapon of flame. His sword is described in sort of Vipara terms as being this living blade of sort of fire and poetic inspiration. He sings his weapons into being using his ancestral mantras because he's a priest. It is that tool that is used to slay one of these adversaries. In that particular case, it's Tristillas rather than necessarily Vritra, but the myths do sort of blend together. The point is, what we have in the Vedic sphere is this understanding of applying piety, you might say, applying faith, hence the fire, hence the song, hence the intervention of the goddess who's quite connected with these things, rather than just the brute force approach. In the Hellenic sphere, this has been kind of preserved because you have this application via, divine inspiration, because Athena turns up and says, guys, use the flame, use this, this thing that I'm telling you to do, this direct divine revelation. But of course, you also have those rather more simplistic narratives which instead go, we're just going to hit it repeatedly in the neck with a blade, a harpe, until of course eventually the problem is solved via sort of that brute force thing. As you can see, if you know how to look, the stuff fills out, but unless you had that interpretation guide over here in the Vedic sphere, it'd be rather difficult to re-engineer it from first principles. That's why we need to use this comparative theological approach in order to flesh out what's going on with particular myths, and then correlate them to the particular rituals we might carry out, which are cognate with these elements.
And I hear you say operational, and we, like you said, we had an offline discussion before, and we spoke about some fascinating stuff. You don't just mean revive some of the basic rituals for tradition's sake. You actually believe that these things have power, and they have power to affect our reality, the way pharmaceuticals have power, the way weapons have power. And you mentioned a few examples. I don't want to mention them myself because it came from private conversations, but feel free to share them if you will.
Yeah.
About rituals actively affecting reality.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll start, I suppose you might say, from first principles. Now, when we look at myth is, it's a horribly bowdlerized term. Because, as once again our great friend Eliade pointed out, the original meaning of myth was subverted as an exercise in culture jamming by, you might call them, Christian authorities. Myth originally meant an explanatory story. It became, a false story because the people in question wanted to say, well, those guys over there, their explanatory stories are false. Now, what we mean by an explanatory story is, in effect, it's a pattern. It's a narrative. Like, that's what a narrative is. It's a pattern. When we are deploying and operationalizing myth, we are engaging in that pattern. When we are chanting mantras, when we are carrying out ritual actions, we are sort of sparking up a particular pattern. When I chant a mantra, that's a pattern which then sort of impacts the reality around me. When I simply use a sentence of English and sort of talk to you using these patterns in reality called language, on a very mundane level, that's one way in which this sort of takes place. When we are using the empowered speech, Sanskrit, when we're sort of carving runes, I have a few examples of that floating around the place. That's once again using these patterns that are keyed to and resonate with broader patterns out there, both in reality and above and beyond reality. We are drawing down those patterns into our sphere and then participating it in an active sense. Now, in terms of the question which you sort of asked, I am a religious fundamentalist zealot. I mean, it's a shameful thing, some might say. I don't see it that way at all. I see it as a simple acknowledgement of truth.
Yeah, you'll need to unpack that for our listeners.
Well, okay. People talk about faith as being a situation of believing in things without proof, without evidence. I don't have that. I mean, I suppose to a certain extent we all do, because we believe, for example, that people outside our head actually do exist, to sort of reference some René Descartes and bits and pieces like that.
But yes, exactly.
In terms of
metaphysics, metaphysics are underlining everything ultimately, as scientific as you might want to be.
Or perception, all a matter of the interface between ourselves and the exterior world. But in terms of my situation, like, I don't go, okay, well, I take it on faith that the gods exist. I know I've had various encounters and experiences which have led me to an absolutely unshakable conviction that the Indo-European gods, pretty much the same ones that were around on the Urimat 6,000 years ago, are very much still around, still active, and still engageable with today. Now, of course, this leads to a situation that annoys the hell out of me, whereby people assume that because Greece is no longer the pre-Christian religious bastion that once was, or the Nordic sphere is en masse converted, this means Odin is dead. This means Zeus is dead. Somebody's gone to Mount Olympus, switched out the lights, and gone off and said, "Guys, we're finished." I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, possibly in the case of Mount Olympus, they may have recamped to Kailash and Mount Meru over in the east, but it's a situation whereby the same gods very much still do exist. In terms of my personal experiences with these, various situations whereby I've had cause to use various mantras, various thotrams, hymnals, we might say, carry out various rites or have rites carried out for me, they've caused literally miraculous things to happen. Now, we don't talk about these with outsiders for a number of reasons, but without getting too deep into it, I can definitely say that when they're done properly, done sincerely, and done with the active, spirit to them, they have such tangible effect. Now, whether you want to approach that ecumerically, we might say, and say that people believing things can cause reality to shift. There is some evidence on sort of a quantum physics basis that this can in fact take place. Or whether you want to, you can approach it on that basis and say believing in stories, engaging with stories, is therefore yoking, we might say, your belief to this great big belief sphere. You believe in it a lot more because these stories resonate. They have some sense of truth, even if you don't necessarily believe in the gods in question. It's not how I approach things, but it is definitely how people can approach them. But in terms of sort of why we're doing all of this, the reason why we advocate for the restoration and resurrective reincarnation of Indo-European faith also in the West is not, as you say, simply for tradition's sake. It's a great thing, don't get me wrong, that people can engage with it without necessarily having the bedrock of that sort of fundamentalist zeal. I mean, in my personal sort of capacity, my previous life, I was a bit of a drug addict, we'll put it, on a mild end of things, got into some severe trouble with it as a result. Part of the ways I got clean, sober, everything else, under my, as I say, Indo-Nepali family's sort of tutelage in that regard, was the regularity of ritual, was, sort of being at mandir twice a week, so on and so forth. I then operationalized that model, and with one of my devotees, when she turned up in my life with a very similar life story, it was spookily resonant how similar it was. That was the regimen we put her on. She managed to overcome not only the drug addiction stuff that she'd been grappling with, but also a condition of aphasia, which she'd acquired through a rather bad brain injury, which had led to a hypoxic sort of debilitation. She overcame that through these ritual efforts that we put her through, which brought her back in touch with her heritage and enabled her to build a better and more positive self-identity. So even leaving aside the divine sphere stuff, which I truly believe had a strong impact upon her recovery, you can say that even for its own sake, you can get benefits from engaging in these spheres. These aren't sort of idle, woo, sort of magical things. There are scientific attestations for engaging in mantra meditation, even Catholic praying the rosary, will have positive effects for your brain. It's quite simple. But in terms of why we do these things beyond the traditional element, it is, or indeed beyond the identity element, because of course identity is quite important. The fact that so we are who we are, the fact that we have these roots that are the foundation of who we are and enable a bulwark against the corrosive forces of modernity, that must be acknowledged. We believe, as I say, the gods are real, and therefore one of our prime purposes in life is to engage with them, worship them, and know one's place within the universe by their side, working towards their holy purpose. In terms of something else which we talked about on the sort of the pre-interview conversation, the toxicity of modernity. One of the things about modernity... Now, postmodern...
Yeah, no, this is a huge topic that fascinates me, so I'd like to just split it off a little bit there, just to play devil's advocate, as I should in this position and for my audience. So what you're saying is that the reason you want to reconnect with the gods is simply because they are there. In the same way you want to eat well because your body functions in a certain way objectively, whether you believe or not that smoking is bad, it's bad. So you want to stop smoking in a very objective scientific way, and it's in the same way that you want to reconnect with something just because it's objectively there, from what I understand now, which is fascinating and very honest, rather than dressing it up with many epithets, just saying, look, they're there, therefore I need to have a good relationship with them if they're affecting my life. But to play devil's advocate and to just publicly admit that I always stand in the middle of these things. I'm fascinated, but I want to be very slow in approaching them, because I've seen a lot of people that literally go off the rails with too much unsubstantiated belief. I want to stand on firm ground.
Definitely.
Therefore, just to play the devil's advocate, like I said, the term illusion comes to mind. A lot of people out there are going to say, Cohen, I'm sure you've seen Zeus or the equivalent of, but I've been on LSD and I've seen dragons, they're going to say. And I use this example quite intentionally because there is something to the psychedelic experience. I've talked about this on this show, on Ancient Greece Revisited. It's been a theme, if you will, because I've had it. I've had the psychedelic experience. I'm not ashamed to say it. And I've noticed that there is a big misinterpretation there. Just before, knowing any of these substances, I just used to hear stories that you take a pill and all of a sudden you just see things around, things that are not there. That's not quite it. That does not capture the experience. Sure, you can see certain things, although you would need very high doses to actually see someone walking through the door the way I would see a natural person. To have this 100% immersive illusion, you would need to go very high up on the scale. But way before that, you can take doses where you do see things, quote unquote, but it's not the seeing, it's the understanding of the seeing that is the most fascinating thing. It's not that a flower can appear more vivid, or in my case, being kind of reined in by a waterfall of colors. It's not just that you can reproduce with a good 3D software. You could reproduce. It's not that. There's an understanding that comes with it, as if you see the flower and you understand it's a manifestation of something of which perhaps we have no words. And then you'll read some Sufi story or poem talking about this flower, and you'll be, that's it. That's exactly what I felt. And there you start drawing connections. There's some kind of understanding. So I guess the answer for me, and I'll just pass it to you, someone says they're all illusions. I would say, well, they're illusions of understanding, if they are illusions at all. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite correct insofar as the psychedelic experience aided by pharmacopoeia. People often seem to think it's a deliriant experience, which is quite a different thing. In terms of what you've said about changing the way you view the world, well, yes, that of course means that what you see changes. It's just that what you see changes not in the sense of everything sort of becoming actively delirious, but more how you see it changes and how you interact with it changes, especially because you then get the implications of everything, which can become quite a sort of paralyzing experience. Now, yes, every perceptual experience that we have is ultimately, to a certain extent, illusory. The fact that, as of course the old canard goes about electrical impulses to your brain is what, of course, we're responding to, does mean that there's already a barrier between us and absolute reality, which we are sort of having to navigate and traverse. We compensate for this in various ways. One of the ways is by having this, this wonderful stereoscopic vision. That means we have depth perception rather than necessarily succumbing to some optical illusions. If you're going spearfishing for fish in a river, you compensate with the fact there's that sort of strange angle due to the light being refracted. Now, in terms of what you're talking about with illusion, because there were several layers to that in that particular series of points raised. The first one to be said, I'll address them in somewhat chronological order, with the, we might call it sort of a spiritual wiccanry. You're absolutely correct, and it comes back to that Nietzsche quote which you mentioned at the start of the show. Those people who wind up so desperate to find something to engage with, something to grab onto, they'll grab onto not just anything, but all sorts of things simultaneously, in a desperate bid to try and build themselves some form of meaning. That is the way you overcome illusion, to my mind, is meaning. Actual, genuine, and truthful meaning, rather than the illusion, which it's like a signal-to-noise ratio. What we have a lot in modernity is a lot of noise. We're in the information age. There's a lot of information flying around the place. Now, if anybody's read Finnegan's Wake, sort of that great Irish novel that's basically indigestible in various sorts of fashions, it's a lot of almost random words strung together. You can get some meaning out of it, sure, but it's not really direct. There's a very sort of different signal-to-noise ratio. What we're doing with a lot of these religious practices is we're trying to filter through a lot of that noise and get to signal. Now, with the attested sort of religious sphere, religious canons that have been in place for thousands of years with demonstrable track records of working, a lot of that work's already been done for us, which is very sort of handy. It's tradition, we know it works, it's a good reason to engage upon that thing, rather than going with this syncretical grab bag approach, whereby everything that turns up to you via Google on that particular day of the week, you decide you're an ardent believer in, because in that case you're just adding different sorts of hopeful signals, more likely noise, and getting yourself very confused, and possibly going in some very bad directions as a result. Now, in terms of the psychedelic side of things, yes, the issue that we have is that people taking drugs, there's no guarantee that somebody taking any substance is going to get the benefits of somebody who's trained and prepared for quite some time to derive a benefit from that. You may as well chuck somebody into an Olympic swimming pool and go, okay, I'm now expecting you to sort of do 25 laps in a really sort of very brief time. Some people, if they're trained and prepared for it, will be able to do well. Other people may not even be able to swim. They may in fact drown. Their minds may break to continue the psychedelic sort of side of things. One of the horrible illusions that we have is that people can just take drugs and wind up an instant guru, can wind up instantly enlightened as a result. In some cases, I'm sure it's quite possible, and in some other cases, much a broader number, people will wind up with some insight that may be very useful to them if they can internalize it, or they might wind up with something that keeps them awake at night for the next 3 years. It's a very sort of difficult thing to predict. I believe that in terms of how things worked in antiquity, a lot of the times the entheogenic substances which were sort of available weren't something that were just handed out willy-nilly like candy. Instead, they were closely controlled. What you had was a shamanic class, you might sort of say, a shamanic class to use the Sanskrit sort of root of the term, who'd be able to both A, take it themselves because they know what they're doing with it and derive particular insights therefrom, but B, guide people in initiatory rites and other such things in a particular ritual context, festival context, which then gives structure and helps them to make sense of those particular experiences which they're having. What we have in modernity is a lack of anything like this for the most part. Like, sometimes you might wind up with an old hippie head who's going to, act as your sitter, act as your guide, and, sort of help you to negotiate the psychic terrain that you're going to traverse. The fact that
trip sitter, I think it's a better term, a more honest term. They just sit throughout the trip.
Well, it depends upon who you've got. I mean, if you're, that's an ideal situation. You also get people who will occasionally have some practical jokes, if you will, while things are sort of in motion. But if you're really lucky, you'll have somebody who's been through this sort of stuff before, is quite experienced with it, and is also experienced with the stories that might sort of unfold, who can help to guide and shape your trip and experience, so therefore you get more out of it as a result of the appropriate inner journey. Now, in terms of how this sort of fits into, I suppose you might say, the resurrective side of things, one of the fascinating dimensions to Hellenic spirituality is, of course, the mystery cults, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries, of course, the Orphic mysteries. We have very fragmentary attestations to what was going on in those. In some cases, we have reasonable supposition that ergot might have been involved as an active hallucinogen. I don't know. Like, some of the time, I don't even think it's necessary. Like, the drugs are a chemical key to open a door. There may be other ways of opening this door. In fact, we know for a fact there are. And of course, more to the point, the stuff that you experience going through this door doesn't require drugs in order to exist. But in terms of those initiatory religions, the trouble is they were mysteries, quite literally. So therefore, we don't have anything apart from some archaeological fragments, for example, the golden leaves of the Orphic sphere, for example, and other sort of bits and pieces that people have pieced together, or occasionally have wound up reading into stuff that we have elsewhere. We do have, over in the Hindu sphere, once again, these initiatory, well, you might call them mystery cults in certain sort of senses, that have some very interesting resonancies for what's going on over here in the esoteric spheres of both the Nordic sphere, the Hellenic sphere. You get the idea. So if there's any hope of resurrection, once again, it's going to lie to the east. But to dial things back into that psychedelic sort of side of things, what Brahman, Brahmana, we should say, technically speaking, means. People think it's a priest caste, and it's not entirely wrong. Well, of course, Varna and Jati are quite sort of different understandings. I must emphasize that particular point. But in terms of what a Brahmana is in the sort of the Vedic typology, a Brahmana is a knower of Brahman. Now, Brahman should not be confused with Brahma. People often sort of do. Side issue. Brahman is Proto-Indo-European berg would be a good way of explaining it. I'm slightly mispronouncing that, but I'm doing so to emphasize the connection with berg in Germanic languages, which of course means mountain. So of course you have iceberg and things like that, Battenberg, the original name Mountbatten, so on and so forth. Berg in Proto-Indo-European means high, exalted. So of course it turns up in some terms for chieftainship, but also in this Brahman context for the absolute, the highest, the supernal. So, a Brahmana is somebody who knows this supernal, has some connection with that supernal sort of sphere. In terms of that soma thing, that's partially why it's there, because it facilitates the seeing of reality as it actually is, as something which is secondary to this absolute. You penetrate through that veil of Maya. Maya, later text tends to mean illusion, but in earlier texts it more means sort of magical power. There's a subtle distinction there. So, in terms of what's going on with that psychedelic experience you're talking about, and the perceiving of truth, rather than sort of the bewilderment by illusion, that's exactly what is at the heart of Indo-European spirituality. The absolute, and its immanence out here into this reality of ours. Now, this is vitally important because to bring things together with what you'd mentioned about the objective truth position that I was sort of holding, the objective truth which we believe in is not simply that the gods are there, but also that it is our duty to carry out morally righteous actions alongside and in service of them. Now this brings us to one of the things I definitely wanted to talk about with you today, which is the notion of cosmic order, and the fact that it's often mediated by a divine feminine sort of persona. But in terms of cosmic order, that is that absolute. We find this mentioned very clearly in the Nordic texts, whereby there's this concept called orlog. It's often translated as fate, and while it is kind of in later texts understood in that sense, the actual meaning of it, the order particle means sort of outside, beyond, well, I suppose you might say above. The log bit is sort of precedent, law, sort of established counsel, that kind of thing. So putting it together, it is supernal law. This turns up in the Locusena, for example, with Frigg being stated to have the grandest connection of any deific to it. It turns up in the Greek sphere to a certain degree with the, as I say, divine feminine personifications like Dike, of course, which derives from Proto-Indo-European Dake. Dake means to point out, it means sort of justice, that sort of thing. Of course, her mother Themis would be the great example to draw from, whom, per I think it's Statius' Theobald, although I'll have to check the citation, whom even Zeus gives way to when it comes to proper and proprietary action. Now, this is rather interesting when it comes to the Socratic sphere, because people often bring up the Socratic dialogue of Euthyphro, which is a story about a priest of Athens being ambushed by a Socratic dialogue and having this big, long thing about, okay, so are the gods righteous, or, it's a very...
It still lingers in theology, the Euthyphro Dilemma. Which just to summarize for our audience, it's a simple question, but it's a very interesting one. It's whether the gods are just, whether something is just because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is just. It's fascinating because it does mean that there are things that are just good, just, correct, and the gods being perfect just naturally gravitate to them. Or does something become good simply because the god chooses to love it? And he could just, in that context, perhaps add an 11th commandment. Are the commandments 10, and therefore God could only speak of 10 because he is perfect? Or they're 10 because he decided and he could have added an 11th one if he so wished? That's a nutshell of the problem.
There's actually over 600 commandments in the Old Testament, if memory serves, but I also do quite like the way it winds up being summarized in terms of the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, in which effectively you wind up with the Great Commandment, which is basically sort of worship that particular God, and of course love thy neighbor as thyself. It's an elegant summary. Not my theology, that is my father's theology, but we have a lot to agree upon in some regards. But yes, you're quite right in terms of that synopsis. Although the point which we must draw out is the fact this idea of morally perfect gods is not really how the Indo-European schema works. It's very big in in some areas of the Platonic schema, although various Neoplatonists have sort of resiled from that quite sensibly, and leads to that whole thing, partially why I think from memory Socrates was put on trial for impiety, because you wind up with these sort of peculiar claims about, oh yes, the events of the Iliad, etc., they could not have happened because the gods would never act in sort of disunity and discord and sort of in these morally fallible fashions. One of the things I quite like about the Indo-European sort of religion and theology, our gods, I'm not going to say that they're human. I'm not going to say they have human traits. I'm rather going to say that humanity has some divine resemblant traits. It's the other way around. But you find them engaging in things that are sort of not quite perfect. Like, for example, you wind up with... you wind up with Shiva, for example, smoking too much weed and having sort of domestic quarrels with his wife. It's the perfect relationship, literally described as such. And yet it also has these sort of domestic feuds that take place, whereby they both wind up sort of at loggerheads. In fact, as a slightly amusing aside, they wind up having game matches against each other, dice, gambling, that sort of thing. Now, the slight issue with this is they're both omniscient and omnipotent. So how can two omniscient and omnipotent gods play dice against each other? And the answer is they cheat wildly. And it becomes this great contest to basically sort of see who can cheat better versus who can actually sort of call out the other person on cheating. But I digress. I just like that story. But in terms of the Indo-European situation, what we have is cosmic order, a priori to the gods, above the gods. Generally speaking, the gods do in fact abide by cosmic order, except in particular instances whereby this doesn't quite happen. So, for example, there's one famous story from the Nordic sphere whereby Odin needs to conceive a particular son of his, another god, in order to carry out a vital avenging role towards the war at the end of time. Now, unfortunately, the figure that he needs to impregnate in order to have this, this son be born is a giantess by the name of Runda, who is not keen on Odin for various reasons. Now, Odin winds up raping the giantess in question. Now, I'm not saying that to condone it, and in fact, funnily enough, the mythology doesn't either. What winds up happening is, even though it's regarded as being a necessary action because, the sun was prophesied, foretold, so on and so forth, it's also regarded as being a morally repugnant action and an illegal action which mandates Odin being subject to criminal sanction, being cast out, going into exile, and having to give up his kingdom. Now, one can possibly argue that the notion of the wandering god going into exile may not be quite the punishment it first appears, but it's interesting. Another example, which is quite prominent in the Hindu sphere, and funnily enough, is actually drawn from the same mythology that informs the mythology around Orion in the sort of the Hellenic sphere. Basically, to give a short version of it, what happens is Rudra, Shiva, he is challenged for supremacy by Brahma, and one of the things that sort of takes place in this is Brahma also starts making improper advances towards Rudra's wife. Rudra is very protective of his wife, as of course one would probably assume, and therefore winds up, initially there is the chance to surrender, before of course the wife bits sort of come into play, at which point Rudra manifests from the sort of the pinky nail, I believe, this form called Bhairava. Bhairava means terror, terrific, sort of very literally terrifying form, armed with an axe, because of course he is a sort of the executioner form, you might sort of say, and he goes and literally cuts Brahma down to size by decapitating him in order to sort of get him to stop behaving stupidly. Now, the thing about this is that Brahma is a Brahmin, as you would probably expect. In fact, most of the gods involved in this are also Brahmins. The sin of Brahmahatya means, the killing of a Brahmin, is one of the most egregious sins that you can commit. The reason for this is because those Brahmins have a connection to, Brahman, the Absolute. You are cutting down a point of saliency, a point of connection with the Absolute in our world. That's why it's so egregious. So what winds up happening is, even though it's a divinely mandated action that Bhairava has undertaken there, in defense of cosmic order, the fact that he's carried out an illegal act in order to do it means that he winds up punished, he winds up sanctioned, he winds up having to go on a penitent quest to absolve himself of the guilt that he's committed. Now, in terms of another example of pretty much the same phenomenon, broadly speaking, Indra versus Tristillas and, of course, Vritra, these two figures are also, funnily enough, they have a Brahminical status. So the decapitation of these demon dragon figures leads to Indra having to go on a penitent quest. The funny thing is, in a slightly jumbled format, this actually marries up with the mythology around Hercules, and Hercules' 10 tasks in that particular penitent quest. Where I'm going with this is the gods are not above cosmic order. Neither are humans. However, the gods are A, a hell of a lot closer to this absolute than we are, and B, the foremost defenders of it in the heavenly sphere. But of course, C, above a lot of these gods, and a consistent typology we see throughout the Indo-European sphere, tends to be a queen god figure that does tend to have quite close connectivity to this particular cosmic order as its in-universe expression. In the Hindu sphere, we would, funnily enough, find this to be Vach Devi, that particular goddess of speech I mentioned earlier, who is cognate with Athena. So, in terms of why we're doing this, this worshipful action, it is not simply because the gods are objectively there. It is also because, as I said, it is objectively the case that it is our duty to be in concord with cosmic order, to be worshipping them as part of, once again, the ultimate objective truth being cosmic order and the necessity, the vital necessity of shoring it up within our universe.
Great, a lot of topics covered there. I had an interview with someone who, not a devotee at all, an academic rather, devoted part of his life to the goddess Artemis in a very academic way. We have an interview in Ancient Greece Revisited called "Oh My Goddess." If one wants to listen, I think it was a great interview. And there we touched upon the idea of anthropomorphism in Greek religion, because that is the one point that Christians have always mocked, the Greeks, or the pagans as they call them, that they worship gods with their genitals hanging out, I guess. And this professor, Spiridon Rangos, said that first of all we have to wonder at this, like this, the anthropomorphization is not obvious. We think it's obvious because we say, oh, right, so these, and it's a very modernist view, which is what I want to touch next, that, these silly pagans, they imagined gods being just like them because that was the limit of their imagination, so to speak. But Professor said, no, think about it. It's not obvious that you imagine a god in human form. It's not obvious. And as a proof is that it has not been imagined universally. It's particularly in the Greek sphere, in the absolute, where all the gods are 100% anthropomorphic, and I guess you might say in the Indo-European sphere, where you have variations of. But the conclusion of this professor was that, once we wonder, we have to think that perhaps what this means is that the Greeks in particular believed that the human form was an adequate vehicle for spirit and for the divine, right?
I mean, there's a few things I'd like to pick up on with regard to that. The first one is it's interesting you brought up Artemis, because there's a slightly contentious but rather plausible theory that Artemis, the first particle, the Arte element, may actually be cognate with Rita, that is to say cosmic order. I also have several articles on a lesser-known deific called Artemis Orthia, which I believe to be a close cognate, once again, expression of Archdevi, but you can look those up at some other point. But in terms of the anthropomorphic side of things, it's interesting that you bring this up, especially in terms of a claim, well, a Christian objection to anthropomorphic elements as allegedly being sort of improper spirituality. Because, after all, I mean, every Christian knows Christ is, it turns up in human form. I mean, that's literal anthropomorphism, is Christ turning up in human form. You can't get around that. Now, you can argue, of course, that the reason why this happened is because it's easier to interface with humans when you're doing that, rather than turning up in the whole be not afraid thing like the angels of the Old Testament. Yes, we completely agree. So, in terms of, engaging with gods in human form, it's a very convenient symbolic shorthand for us humans to have something which we can sort of see a resemblance in to a certain extent, especially when we're basing our conduct, our behavior, off stuff in this divine sphere. However, it's also a very Christian understanding as well, because, well, there's that famous quote we all know, humankind is made in God's image, I believe is the usual translation. So I don't see where the objections from anthropomorphism should actually come through. However,
yes, that's definitely one thing that I pointed in the Greek text is kathikona και καθομοίωση. Ikona is icon, is image. So, and omiosi is likeness. So not just likeness, but actually looking like a human, or humans looking like a god in that case. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things when it comes to that, there's that famous painting which people often reference, Senepa und Pipe. The Treachery of Images is the translation of the title in English. And because it shows quite clearly, the map is not the territory. This image of a pipe is not, in fact, a three-dimensional pipe. We wind up with these symbolic shorthands, and the trouble is that we occasionally forget that that's what they are. Now, in terms of I suppose you might say the iconographic saliency, I do slightly disagree with the notion of the Hellenic sphere 100% having complete anthropomorphism. So, for example, one of the lesser known but very cool in my mind Greek deific figures is Demeter Melena, Demeter the Black. Now, according to Pausanias' travelogue, which is a fascinating document because it has all these lovely bits of arcana that didn't make it into sort of the main pop cultural version of Greek mythology, but were very much local traditions that were preserved right up until his day. The purportedly the murti, we would say, I don't like using the term idol. Idol is obviously a Christian term, which basically means, something fake, something that is being worshipped, almost on its own terms. This is not the Indo-European view. The Indo-European view, as we see with the murti concept, is that a living statue of the god or goddess has a spark of that divinity in it, so we're worshipping the god or goddess through that fine, beauteous work of stone. It's like the distinction between saluting a flag and going, I'm saluting a piece of fabric, versus saluting what the flag represents, the country, the nation. It's a vitally important distinction.
You see through the symbols.
Exactly.
Not at the symbols.
And of course, we can wind up with people getting sort of muddled up and thinking that the flag itself, the piece of cloth, rather than what it represents, is the important thing.
Is the nation, yeah.
But in terms of the Demeter Melena figure I'd sort of mentioned, she has a horse head, if memory serves, which makes logical sense because, of course, the main myth she turns up in, she actually is in horse form being pursued by Poseidon, a myth which has direct concordancy with the situation of Surya and Tharanyu over there in the the Vedic sphere. It's one of those things you can quite easily reconstruct. So it makes sense for her to have this horse head. Another example which we can quite easily draw from, two examples actually. The Hekatoncheres, the 100-handed figures that turn up in those early clades of sort of the cosmology. I suspect rather strongly that the reason why they're 100-handed or 100-armed, we might say, is because those elements may represent lightning bolts. In a big storm, that's what sort of happens. You see all these arms reaching down from the heavens. In a similar sort of fashion, the Cyclops, how do you pronounce it? There's two different clades of Cyclops in Greek mythology, and people often conflate the two without quite meaning to. Everybody knows Polyphemus, the one that Odysseus, no man has put my eye out. It's a wonderful story for a number of reasons. Otis, I should say, not Nemo. Nemo be the Latin. But in terms of the other clade of Cyclops, you have the Uranian Cyclops, who actually sort of help. I think it's Zeus. I will have to check, but help in one of these sort of these restorations of divine order by carrying out these priestly actions, by providing weaponry, so on and so forth, which is necessary. They're Smith gods, after a sense. The funny thing is, they appear to be reasonably directly cognate in their mythology to what are known as the Rebus in the Vedic sphere. Rebus, they're effectively, once again, solar smiths who appear to possibly be cognate with elves, linguistically and in a number of other senses, possibly cognate, in the Nordic sphere, these elf smiths. So Tolkien was onto something with elf smiths being quite good. The thing about these Cyclops, the defining feature, literally in the name, is that they have one eye. I suspect that what was being encoded there was a solar understanding, because you frequently encounter these symbolic shorthands in the Vedic sphere, whereby the eye of the Skyfather, is this or other Devis, as the case may be, is this one glaring eye because it's the sun. So if you have these solar smiths, and, one big eye in the sky is your shorthand for sun, it makes sense to have Cyclops as being, you can see how the symbolic shorthand works.
Yes, and... Yeah, and I guess the Cyclops, what you're mentioning is that, yes, Cyclops, I remember there's this giants with one huge eye that in their forehead, kind of monsters. But they're, in Greek mythology, you're right, they're very, very ancient, perhaps even more ancient than the gods. And the interesting fact is that the Cyclops, plural, give Zeus his thunder. So and Zeus, of course, is the thunder god, but apparently he wasn't before that gift, So there's some order pre-existing that of the gods, which, it's fascinating in itself. Absolutely.
It's interesting. Now, that's a very cool point to sort of draw out a bit. Now, in terms of bestowing Zeus with his thunderbolt, there's several different renditions of it in the Greek mythology. The one that I'm quite partial to. Now, Aeschylus is, of course, a Greek tragedian, a great Greek tragedian, as of course everybody knows, or should know, I should say. But in terms of the Greek, both the comedy and the tragedy side of it, while there is a vulnerability to poets and dramaturges, hyping things up and putting, their own spin on things, which can lead to distortions, I also believe that there are some quite archaic wells of truth which these guys were mining, and which we can only find because it hasn't really been preserved elsewhere. I'm getting some slightly strange hand gestures there, but okay, I'll just continue. In terms of Aeschylus, in this particular regard, in his play The Eumenides, which of course talks about the Erinyes being sort of, I suppose you might say, deciding to play ball with Athena. They wind up particularly under her sort of command following the Agon, if I remember correctly. There's a mention given there for Athena being the figure who unlocks the storehouse where the thunderbolt of Zeus is kept. Now, this is interesting to us because it concords directly with what we find in the Vedic sphere, whereby Vachdevi, who we've met several times before, is vitally necessary in order to sort of unlock both the Vajra, which winds up being utilized by Indra, although we should emphasize, and I'll make a brief point on this in a moment, that Indra is not Zeus, but also empowers the weapon of Rudra, who is Zeus as it happens, to be able to do what it needs to do in terms of striking the haters of Dharma, the haters of the Brahmanas. To pick up on that brief point there, so what we have there is the goddess correlate with speech and various of these sort of priestly activities and empowerments, who is vitally necessary for these solar smiths who are also priest-like when we look at the rebus, to actually sort of do their thing to generate the Vajra or the thunderbolt which is being utilized. Now, to briefly pick up on that other point, something which people often make a big mistake about is they say Indra is Zeus. You can find it on Wikipedia, you can find it all over the place. That's because they erroneously assume there's a one thunderer limit when it comes to Indo-European mythology, and because Indra is referred to as a Deva Raja and stuff like that, that therefore means that he's directly cognate with Zeus being, obviously the king of the gods. Here's the thing. Indra is the son of Dyaus-Pittara. Dyaus-Pittara directly cognate with Zeus Pater, as of course we previously sort of demonstrated, talked about. The mythic concordancy once again, in terms of not just the parentage, but some of the other deeds, some of the slaying, so on and so forth. Indra, Hercules, you get the idea. So, and of course you also wind up with various other figures wielding a thunderbolt style sort of weapon, including, funnily enough, various thunder associations for, of course, Athena, and other stuff of that particular nature. I just thought I'd make a brief point in that particular regard. But in terms of the symbolic stuff that gets encoded in all of this, to go back to our friend Demeter Melania, that notion of Demeter the Black, is vitally important in terms of bashing over the head, if you like, another canard that often comes up, which is that something like skin color should be taken literally when we're talking about mythology. So, Demeter the Black, or Demeter Ernyes, as I more frequently would refer to her as, what she is this dark, furious form of Demeter. Demeter's, sort of formerly sort of quite light and sort of radiant and sort of blonde, etc. Visage becomes black because A, she's in mourning after something has gone rather awry in her family situation, but B, she's also in that furor state, hence the Ernyes sense, and is going around punishing and sanctioning those who carry out, violations of this cosmic order principle. So, we'll park that up over here because, of course, she's said to have this dark black complexion, which she washes off in a sacred river. Now, over here in the Hindu sphere, we have this figure called Kali. Kali quite literally translates as black. However, it also translates as time, it also translates as death. And in fact, when Oppenheimer has that wonderful quote people often cite about, "And now I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." It's appropriate for a nuclear explosion, especially because the brightness of 1,000 suns is earlier in the same verse. But in terms of the actual original sort of Sanskrit for the verse in question, it's actually Kal that is being used there, and it's to communicate simultaneously the sense of time and death, because what's happening, to briefly sort of digress, what's happening is Krishna is urging Arjuna to carry out this awful deeds of killing his own cousins in this massive civil war that's going on by saying, look, if you don't kill him, they're inevitably going to die anyway due to time and my divine will. So therefore, let me show you this. I'm going to become time/death and show you they're going to be dead anyway. So therefore, please go out and do the duty which I'm sort of handing down to you. Brief tangent on that. But of course, that doesn't quite work so well for a nuclear explosion. Now, in terms of this Kali figure, as I've said, black, time, death, and is very much furor imbued, is raging, is berserk, is sort of absolutely unstoppable in that particular regard. She is the wife of Shiva, in just the same manner that we find Demeter being attested to be a wife of various expressions of the Skyfather deific in the Greek end of things, and of course directly equated in some of the more lesser known Greek texts with other similar mother goddess expressions. So it's a cognate typology. We can then find the same expression also found in the Nordic sphere when we consider Skadi. Skadi is a name that etymologically works out quite close to shadow, so it's that dark sort of impression once again. She's once again very angry, especially when people violate cosmic order, and her majorly known deed in the Nordic sphere is she carries out the sanction of Loki, who has of course done some very egregious and outright demonic stuff, sentencing him to a rather tormentuous existence until the end of time, having a snake dripping venom into his eyes, so basically until the world ends. So, what we have, and she's the wife of Odin, I should of course emphasize, this parallel sort of set of constructions. To go back to the Hindu sphere, the etymology I believe in for Kali goes back to Proto-Indo-European kel, which means a veil, a covering, those sorts of terms. You can see how this fits with Demeter Ernyes having that veiled sort of complexion, the black sort of patina upon her skin. And of course how it works for the veil and covering, which is the blackness, the night, the time sort of regulations. Well, death effectively has a veil, we'll put it that way. Where I'm going with all of this is that when people talk about Kali, they will say, Kali is black. Must be a non-Indo-European goddess because, obviously black, dark skin, so, that sort of thing. Leaving aside that the Indus Valley civilization does not appear to have been black in a number of sort of senses, what we have here is a demonstration that the same typology of this dark visage for the goddess in question co-occurs across the Indo-European sphere. No, sort of black complexion of humans required for the inspiration. Instead, it represents something else, something which is terrifying, and of course, which is quite directly sort of A, death, but also B, the sanction of ultimate night. The reason why I sort of drew all that out is because A, I wanted to emphasize that taking things literally in that particular regard can lead to some very pernicious and incorrect assumptions, like Kali being a non-Indo-European deific, but also that B, once we look into the symbolism and beyond, okay, well this goddess has black skin, we can find all of these wondrous things that open up the true meaning of the goddess far beyond the actual physical appearance if we're just taking it literally.
And we connect them to Demeter. And yes, just to point something out, because, especially in my show Ancient Greece Revisited, I love to draw the similarities, Joseph Campbell style, but I love to draw the distinctions. And I do believe there's something there about the horse-headed Demeter And I could add more details in that great myth of Eleusis, which is Demeter's daughter Persephone being abducted by Hades. And you have the myth whereby as the footsteps of these girls, kind of the Persephone and the daughters of Okeanos, who were playing in these meadows before Hades broke the earth, cracked open the earth from the underground and grabbed them, and they fell into this pit, abducted by the death god. And as Demeter went looking for them, the trails kind of blended, the girls' footprints blended with footprints of hogs, of wild pigs. And obviously there is this image of a non-anthropomorphic deity, a pig goddess, being engaging in sacrifice by throwing sacrificial victims in a ravine for various purpose. So there's other non-anthropomorphic elements. Yet I have to emphasize, it was ultimately the poet's choice and the people who accepted and adopted his poetry to have purely anthropomorphic deities in the Iliad, in the Odyssey. When Greek mythology crystallized, a choice was made to kind of put away these things which were slight to begin with, and not have a horse-headed god, not have a monkey-headed god. Do you see that difference as important?
Yes and no. Like, one point which I would emphasize is that, like I said, the stuff that we find in the high classical, that's not quite the right term, the stuff that we find in the sort of the pan-classical milieu around, as you pointed out, the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc., doesn't necessarily account for some of the stuff that goes on at the fringes, which we briefly sort of mentioned. Like, for example, you wind up with Hermes having an epithet which refers to him as being sort of, dog or wolf-headed, for example. We also wind up with figures like, to once again reference Pausanias, the Zeus Triophthalmos figure, which was known at Argos. Now, Triophthalmos, I apologize for mispronouncing the ancient Greek, of course means the three-eyed one. There was quite a lot of speculation for some time that, this must be sort of a pre-Indo-European, somehow a figure that had turned up. Except, of course, the notion of a three-eyed sky-father deific is one that it's entirely uncontroversial over in the Hindu sphere. So possibly this notion of a three-eyed sort of element may not necessarily have been sort of exclusively Hindu, even though it was more peripheral to the Greek sphere itself. Now, a very interesting fact about this, because you brought up the Iliad, is that according to Pausanias's, recording of the Argosian folk tradition about it, they believed that the Murti in question had been brought from Troy, that it was one of the ancestral, household gods of Priam et Co. from Ilium. Which is interesting because, of course, theoretically, the Trojans should be a West Anatolian Indo-European people as well. But the point is, it was still engaged in active worship right into sort of these, I think the 2nd century, I'll have to check the precise numbers on that. So while you are correct that the dominant perception that we have from the sort of the high classical sort of milieu does emphasize these much more sort of human and much more sort of immediately relatable sort of sides of things, we also do wind up with these other sort of bits and pieces turning up on a more sort of instantaneous sort of basis. So, for example, in the lesser known, in terms of what kicks off the Trojan War, you wind up with Zeus conceiving, of course, Helen of Troy and a number of other figures. As a brief side tangent on that, Helen of Troy is in fact a solar goddess, still worshipped in Sparta even in sort of the high classical age, and we can reconnect her directly with a Vedic figure called Tapati, but more upon that some other time. How Zeus conceives sort of Helen of Troy, there's two major narratives. One of which, of course, involves Leda, which appears to be a generic term for wife, based around sort of a Western Anatolian sort of linguistic element there, but of course Zeus is in swan form. The other major typology, which I think is quite useful to explore at some other time perhaps, is Zeus and Nemesis, both in swan form, amongst other sorts of animals, being sort of engaged in a similar sort of pursuit to exactly the same myth that we find with that of Poseidon in pursuit of Demeter in horse form, which we've just sort of briefly touched on beforehand. Now, you're completely correct that it does appear that the animalistic characteristics have been significantly de-emphasized. Now, we can demonstrate this with the figures of the Dioscuri. Dios, of course, sort of Deus, Sky Father, heavenly. Kuri, the boys of, so basically Zeus's boys. They're known as that in the classical sphere for, well, both in the Roman sphere and, of course, in the Hellenic one. In the Nordic sphere, we have Hengist and Horsa. Hengist means, a stallion, and Horsa, I'm sure I don't need to translate. Well, horse, obviously. But in terms of the Vedic sphere, we have the Ashvins, also known as the Divo Napata. Divo, of course, Dios, once again, same particle. Napata, like nephew, the descendants of. So, once again, the Skyfather's sons. Directly said to be the sons of Rudra in various Vedic verses, so on and so forth. The Ashvins are pointedly horse-featured in various regards. They turn up in horse-headed sort of fashion. It becomes quite interesting in the ritual corpus, you get the idea. So, what we have is in the Nordic sphere, and in the Vedic sphere, the horse elements are very prominent. They've become residual, you're quite correct, in the classical sphere, although there still are, if you know how to look, various elements that would connect them to a sort of an equine sort of side of things. We often find equestrian statues of the Dioscuri as a precise sort of result.
Yeah. Are you still there?
Yes, as connection gone strange.
Sorry, there must be, it's fine. No, I fully understand that. I want to pivot on a subject that we touched upon, and I want to get deeper. Using psychedelics just to pivot off to modernity, which is a big topic. Carl Jung actually said something that I think every psychonaut today should listen and consider. He said something to the effect of, there's no greater way to convince people of the absolute truth of modern science and modernity and the materialistic science, the science that sees all reality as purely material. There's no greater tool to convince people of the validity of such a science than psychedelics. The reason being, psychedelics are a chemical substance, there's no doubt, and they do induce experiences, like I mentioned, that you need to look up in religious texts. So what Jung was saying, that if you can show that even the most divine of experiences can be induced by chemical means, material means, what else is there to talk about rather than modern science? And I think he was right. So it's funny that today people use psychedelics to escape the clutches of modernity, of this purely materialist world, yet remaining in these clutches more than ever. How do you see modernity? Because it's something that has fascinated me to understand the malaise of modernity, the fact that, as someone talked about, gave a title to the modern world, which I want to repeat. He said, everything is wonderful and no one is happy. I think it's very true. And both sides are very fascinating. The material wealth created by these material sciences, where even poor people today, sometimes they enjoy comforts envied by emperors. Yet even the rich are not fully satisfied. They'll go into depression, they commit suicide, or they take it out on the world trying to change it, and psychedelics is seen as a way out of this, but Jung is saying, no, it's the way in. So what is your relation, like what's happening there?
Yeah, well,
what is the way out?
It's interesting, that particular Jung quote. I hadn't heard that one. It's it's one of those situations, probably very similar to Jesus, whereby one can possibly have a higher regard for the man than some of his followers. Because one thing I'm continually bedeviled by, in multiple senses of the term, is Jungian people who've picked up stuff from the great man and have basically concluded, well, okay, this means everything is just archetypes. Archetypes are projections of the mind. That means nothing's really real. We're just basically constructing stories. As opposed to what I suspect we might sort of think of them as, which is engaging with stories which, they construct us. It's the other way around. They are a priori to us. I'm going to read out a quote which was just sort of brought up, because you brought up escapism. Now, that's a very interesting thing to sort of talk. Actually, before we get on to that, when we're talking about psychedelics, I view them as a tool which, like any other tool, it can, of course, be used in a number of senses. There's a great Terry Pratchett bit whereby, in a sort of, I think it's in Hogfather, which is it's a book about all of these things, meaning and stories, and Santa Claus being played by Death. But in this particular context, Death as Santa Claus is giving a small child a sword. And, it's someone's saying, you can't give a child a sword, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? He's like, well, it's a gift, I'm giving them a gift. And he's like, no, you got to give a child something educational. And Death's like, well, yes, it will be very educational. And he's like, well, what if he cuts himself? He's like, well, that would be a very important lesson then. But you see, that's the thing about tools. You can use them in multiple different ways, you can get into great trouble with them. And while it definitely is the case that you could use, psychedelics, or for that matter, modern physics, to denude your world of, I suppose you might call it meaning or anything supernal to it, by going, okay, well, we can create a simulacra of this sort of experience by casually, imbibing these substances. I don't think that vitiates the external reality of the true experience. In fact, we can cause people to experience all sorts of things through manipulating the electrical patterns in their brain. We can cause people to experience all sorts of things via talking to them, using sort of language just like we're doing right now. We've got imaginations, it's wonderful. This does not vitiate the truth of what's being talked about, or the fact that we can otherwise, when there aren't electrical signals being sort of gemmed around, things being perceived more sort of organically. It's a fundamental fallacy. But in terms of this particular sort of, one brief point before that, I know I keep sort of digressing. Now, on our sort of pre-interview talk, we talked about a guy called Ernst Junger. Great man, wrote Storm of Steel, the World War I autobiographical piece, which is well recommended.
The German Hemingway, as I'd like to call him, but one who actually experienced war.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that his Storm of Steel is very sort of matter-of-fact about quite a number of things, but no less profound as a result, and it's quite a different take on the Western Front than, say, All Quiet on the Western Front, also written by a German. Anyway, the point is, Junger, sorry, I was about to mix up Junger and Jung. In terms of Junger's experiences, his wartime diaries, not from the First World War, but from the Second World War, as we briefly discussed, he was writing about where things had gone wrong. And I can't remember if it was 1943 or 1944, there's a journal entry which basically says, we're living in this wonderful era of modern technology. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but a lot of modern science had advanced in unfathomable senses, even sort of 5 or 10 years ago. And it had generated the most monstrous horrors around. I don't know if he was, referring to the Holocaust or just general warfare in World War II at the time. But the point is, what he said was, theology, once upon a time, was the queen of sciences. The dethronement of this queen had been what had led to this, precisely because there was that lack of meaning, that lack of guidance, and material science could just run amok. Therefore, what he proposed as the remedy to modernity was the restoration of theology to her rightful place as the queen of sciences. Or, in terms of that Hunter S. Thompson way of speech, which we both love, that thing he talks about there, when it comes to the essential hippie fallacy, as he phrases it, of there being something tending to light at the end of the tunnel. The fact that had been forgotten about as people moved from the 1960s into the 1970s, and therefore just became sort of reckless hedonism rather than pursuit of a transcendental experience, because, hey, the transcendental is just sort of imaginary, that's how things wound up going off the rails, precisely because the idea there were rails and the rails were leading you somewhere was now deemed to be something that was false. Now, in terms of postmodernism, which is a term that often comes up, that's the issue. Postmodernism, in its true sense, is an awareness of meta-narratives. It never meant a rejection of meta-narratives until people got a hold of it, both looking to strawman it and or co-opt it for their own nefarious purposes, and turned it into, just because we're aware of these meta-narratives and can recognize them and our place in them, that therefore means we can discard them as all being false. It's never how it was meant to be. But I digress. The quote that I actually meant to read out some minutes ago, pertaining to escapism, comes from a guy called J.R.R. Tolkien. He may be sort of familiar to some of your listeners.
Familiar to the audience, yes.
Great man. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the users of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical, and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse, the better if it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words, and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding him in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or, if and when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and, what is more, they are confusing not always by a sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labelled departure from the miserly of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only onto desertion, but onto real escape. And what are often its companions? Disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking, you only have to say, the land you love is doomed, to excuse any treachery, indeed to glorify it.
Wow, it's I did not know that Tolkien said that. I'll always remember it from now on, that yes, people mistake the attempt to escape a world that you see as a prison to the flight of the deserter, as if you have this duty to remain here. But did he qualify this escapism? Because from what you read, it's clear that Tolkien had almost like a Gnostic view of the world, a world as a prison, quite literally. I did not know that he had one. How did he arrive there, you think?
Well, I should emphasize, of course, that Tolkien was an Orthodox Catholic. That's a slightly strange way of phrasing that. But, of course, this is the man who, when the Vatican II came in and the Latin Rite was abandoned, you'd find him down the back of the church very loudly and in proper Latin, shouting out the actual lines as the priest was trying to do things in English. I love those sorts of anecdotes. No, so a Gnostic typology is not quite accurate in a cosmological sense. The man himself would resile from it, even though, technically speaking, yes, you can definitely regard the idea of a fallen world as being what he found himself in. Now, the nature of that fallen world comes directly back to what you'd asked earlier around modernity, because it's precisely that, sort of that typology, that element, that characteristic that has rendered it the place that must be escaped from. So we see this, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, because you wind up with, sort of the Scouring of the Shire was one of the sections that did not make it into Lord of the Rings, the film trilogy. I am honour bound as a New Zealander to speak positively of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because of course it's a great New Zealand epic now, wonderful thing. But in terms of the Scouring of the Shire, it doesn't actually sort of feature, because they already had sort of a false ending before that. But what you find there is industry encroaching upon this parochial sort of idyllic, rustic sort of, what's the word I'm looking for in Greek?
Rustic in English is perfect. Yes.
Yeah, it's that sort of sense, but that's the ideal. It's like Wordsworth talking about his dark satanic
bucolic. Perhaps you're looking for bucolic, or
wasn't bucolic. It was. It'll come to me, no doubt, at some point in about 5 minutes. I'll digress.
But for listeners, the Shire was the place of departure for the heroes in Tolkien's epic, The Lord of the Rings, and it was thought to be at the far west of his mythical world, and it was like a very, very picturesque England, especially if one has lived in the United Kingdom as I had in England, you'll understand that outside of London, people have this craving for this pastoral, quiet, cottage-like tea-drinking existence. It's very, very strong. This kind of homely comfort, thou shalt not disturb me kind of thing. And that is captured beautifully and idyllically by Tolkien's Shire, which is just an ending of many English towns. Shropshire is one that strangely comes to mind, etc. So at the end of The Lord of the Rings, you're right, there is this image whereby darkness has nearly conquered, has nearly won. Sauron has nearly won, and I think it was through Saruman that the Shire was becoming industrialized, exactly. You might say. And one remembers the descriptions of Karl Marx, of all people, talking about these satanic mills, or even William Blake, I guess, before him, and this is how Tolkien describes the Shire after being industrialized, almost like an England that moves into a very dark 19th century, right? So please carry it on.
Well, that's exactly it. So in terms of this Tolkien situation, what he's done is somewhere between constructed, or we might more accurately say reconstructed, or at least engaged with a particular myth, a particular sphere of meaning. That being that heritage, tradition, and of course he's wonderful in the way in which he manages to bring together two otherwise rather disparate, but of course somewhat synthetic strands with his Catholic Christian sort of sphere, which is why Gondor, of course, is Minas Tirith is basically where Ravana is, the old sort of capital of the Goths. You get the there's a lot of complex stuff we could go into on that front, but the point is that Anglo-Saxon and Germanic tradition alongside the sort of the Christian sort of Catholic one, because this general exaltation of where he had come from, his heritage running over the past 1,000 years, 2,000 years, and which was under threat via this mechanization, this dehumanization in the most tangible possible sense, which would rob all the meaning, all the engagement with these things that were necessary to be human. Now, what is necessary to be human in this particular regard is both the stories and sort of our ability to sort of engage with them, to live them, but also that natural environment, because instead you wind up with the terrors of industrialism, which are just unhealthy, by whichever way you want to sort of look at it. So, in terms of the fallen world that Tolkien is effectively urging the escape from, what he is doing is not necessarily in sort of the, I suppose you might say, the strictly speaking accurate Gnostic typology of the material universe is the one that sort of is fallen, because that's not really how Christian theology works. Some strands definitely do. They often wind up being excommunicated as heretical for various reasons. But in his particular strand, his idea was to actually re-enchant the world that we're in today. Because that's why Middle-earth was, a sort of mythic prehistory of our world. It wasn't some sort of abstract sort of fantasy creation in that particular regard. So, what he's actually urging via escape is first up getting out of the mindset that shackles one to this infernal, literally infernal, sort of material sort of and dehumanizing sphere, to re-engage with stories, because those are what make us human. Those stories, those heritage, to be able to, as we talked about, re-enchant the world and therefore liberate us from our prison by tearing it down around us through those acts of escape that bring the rest of the world with us, we may say.
But what is it particular in modernity? Because it seems to me that what happened is that while, there was always this duality of matter and spirit, and spirit was considered superior and matter was considered as something that draws spirit down, whether in incarnating spirit in human form or reincarnating spirit in human form, or just dragging spirit down through passions, through this watery envelope that is the body, In modernity, it's almost like an inversion happened, whereby matter became the sovereign, and this material existence was seen as all there is and all there is to understand. And once we understand that, we will affect quote-unquote spirit. Spirit needs to be put into quotes this time, because it's not real spirit. But mental processes, our passions, our love, there's this promise through neuroscience, you'd call it today, that these processes are going to be controlled, and through manipulating the material part. So the material part is the superior part in modernity. Yeah. How did this inversion happen, and what were the effects, you think?
To address, I suppose, the latter question first. Now, I'm a surprisingly good fan of some bits of Marx. Now, this is a controversial thing to say, but while I don't necessarily agree with everything he wrote, the Rev. Rawlinson, by the way, has a sideline in referring to Karl Marx as the last of the Old Testament prophets. He's since decided that it's in fact Martin Buber, who's a Christian theologian, but that's another matter for another time, because Marx's big idea was, if this goes on, then this bad thing will happen, so if this doesn't go on, it will be averted, which is exactly how an Old Testament prophet works, but I digress. The point is, Marx was very good at a lot of diagnostic stuff, maybe not quite so much with the solution. In terms of one area where his diagnostic rubric went a bit sideways, but is it's useful in a different sense, is the distinction between base and superstructure. His idea was an economic base is what conditions and influences the superstructure, and therefore all changes basically are the result of economic base stuff going in one direction. He's wrong. In fact, it is useful to talk about base and superstructure, but they both influence each other. The stuff in the superstructure, how we think about economic stuff, forces of production, whatever, significantly influences labor relations. You get the idea. It's a metaphor that I possibly shouldn't have indulged in. The point is...
just to clarify for the listeners, I think what Marx was saying is that, very much like a material scientist, is that the ultimate basis of everything is material production. So, for instance, you have a culture that produces, I don't know, wool, then therefore needs to herd sheep. And then the superstructure is, i.e., the culture, whereby a patriarchal culture is going to emerge. But the ultimate reality is that you just need to tend the sheep to produce wool, and men are better at it. Therefore, and this is why you have this patriarchal ideology. The ideology is secondary, is a derivative, is a superstructure. The structure, the base, is the economic relationships of that society, was Marx's idea. But what you're saying is that there's a two-way there, that ideas are real in some sense, and they do influence our material existence, which will influence our ideas. It's like a loop where, in my opinion, it's not very easy to see what comes first. It's very much ideas and the material circumstances of an individual or of a people is very much like a chicken and egg situation. It's very hard to say which came first.
Exactly.
Right?
Although we must, of course, point out the egg came first by virtue of the fact that before there was a chicken, there was some sort of proto-chicken, and before that's going back far enough, you wind up with dinosaurs which lay eggs. So eventually, you get the idea. But in terms of the base and
but it wasn't a chicken egg. It was not a chicken egg, however.
Despite the fact that it may have contained a chicken, it's a spectrum rather than a discrete categorization. It's fascinating sort of thing.
Exactly.
But in terms of the metaphor that I was sort of trying to extract out of that, my brain does strange things at 2:30 in the morning. It's a situation whereby the interaction of base and superstructure, leaving aside the economic dimensions, matter and spirit, you can view in a similar sort of sense, because of course matter influences spirit, as I pointed out about the brain being a physical organ with some electrical impulses, but of course the other way around as well, because of course the soul, whatever is sort of animating the ghost and machine, can significantly influence what happens with our material, our bodies. We have a big question as to which one therefore is base versus superstructure, if insofar as it matters, and matters, good pun, and which one is actually sort of a priori, or as you say, chicken and egg, in terms of conditioning all this to begin with. I believe that the situation we've found ourselves in is, Nietzsche is a wonderful thinker to keep coming back to. I mean, I don't agree with everything he said. I like some things he said very much, like that quote you've shared at the beginning, and of course that wonderful quote about how he would refuse to believe in a god who couldn't dance, because of course we have Dionysus and we have Nataraja, form of Shiva, Lord of the Dance, and of course Odin does some dances as well. It's just, side issue. Nietzsche was correct in his often misquoted statement about that God is dead. Now, of course, the internet rejoinder to this points out that sort of God is dead, Nietzsche is dead, God, and so on and so forth. And of course, for us here in the Hindu sphere, God is death, because of course Kali, as we pointed out beforehand, well, you can see that goes quite nicely. What we wind up with is a situation whereby when the soul, the spirit, the ethos, you might sort of say, of a civilization goes sideways and becomes less relevant, is sort of actively suppressed in many regards, you wind up with people effectively going, well, okay, what do we do now? They don't often consciously do what do we do now. They often sort of implicitly sort of wind up, as you say, scrabbling for meaning and fulfillment in other senses. And the material is very easy because it's right there. You can grasp it. It's tangible. It requires no imagination to actually sort of latch onto, which is precisely why it's so dangerous, because it winds up crowding out the stuff that does require imagination and a lot more effort to actually sort of engage with, because things are commodified, things are sold to you. In fact, that's actually a large portion of it, is the consumerist side of things, whereby identities, indeed narratives, to reference Freud's nephew, if I recall, narratives being used to sell these things in quite a sort of a subversive fashion. So the question which we must ask is why these narratives, the narrative sphere, the mythic sphere, wound up becoming so much more remote from the people for whom it was previously relevant. Now, one brief tangent on a thing I should bring up. There's a lovely quotation, I don't know where he got it from, but it comes up in one of Terry Pratchett's books. And he talks about humanity as being where the falling angel met the rising ape, in terms of that synthesis of the spiritual and material. It's a wonderful metaphor, because, of course, apes, they're animals, but they're not, well, they have a certain sapience to them. And the important thing about them is their rising, which is, the thing which people often sort of forget, because we often think that if we're locked into an animalistic paradigm, that necessarily means everything's always downhill from there, and it may be in a certain sense, but I digress. The second point that he made is in terms of the self-delusive capacity for humanity. The Latin, taxonomic classification for humanity is we are Homo sapiens sapiens, which to translate effectively means doubly wise man. What an arrogant thing to say. We're doubly wise. Great us. What Pratchett actually pointed out in the relevant thing that I'm sort of referencing is that the appropriate taxonomic classification for humanity should be pan-narans. Pan, of course, in this context, meaning sort of a monkey or a chimpanzee. Narans meaning storytelling, so we're the storytelling monkey. That's one of those things that, we'll bring back to it in a moment. In terms of, to pick back up where we left off, what's actually led to this sort of this death of God, death of meaning, and it's the death of God in us rather than the death of the gods out there. The immense dislocation which accompanied various transition points in history is what's led to it. Now, one of these, as a grand example, is, of course, the Christianization of Europe. This was a dislocation which displaced the relationship of people to their folk religion, their ancestral ways, and we may say the gods they're directly related to, and a bunch of other ancestral traditions. Overnight, stuff that had been an immanent part of their fabric of being for literally, generations, centuries, millennia even, was now suppressed, or imperfectly suppressed, you might say. It often persists in an underground format, and therefore you wind up with a damage done to the identities in question. However, it's not terminal yet, because you wind up with this being replaced with A, Christianized forms of previous beliefs, B, the Christian religion is still a religion, or in fact several religions which are part of a general complex, you might sort of suggest, so it's not quite fatal yet. What happens after that is the Renaissance is often sort of pointed as being another one of these great sort of transition things. In a sense, I suppose you could say that it is. However, I don't think it's necessarily as fatal as people often insist that it is, because you wind up actually with a much greater accessibility for a lot of folk ways and folk tradition. You wind up with the Bible being presented in...
and just to interject there, it's not the Renaissance. I mean, there is a shift that brings in the modern world, which I've been fascinated about, and it's not in Dante, it's not in Pico della Mirandola. It's a little further, just an inch. You move from, Mirandola's ode to man, his exaltation, short work, speech that he gave late 15th century, where he proposes a merging of all knowledge, mystical, scientific, the Kabbalah with the ancient Greeks, and it's full of allegory and full of spiritual juice. And a century later, almost, you get Descartes, which says, nope, it's much simpler. There's a mathematically measurable world of essentially numbers out there, and in my head as well, and these two connect with God, and that's it.
They become mechanistic, you might sort of suggest. See, that
exactly.
That Renaissance sort of era, even though, of course, it involves a sort of a devolution from some of the higher religious elements, that's almost partially the point, because you make it more accessible for ordinary people. Suddenly, you actually have the sort of flowering of belief in various spheres. Admittedly, in some regards, it goes in various strange directions, and cultural Protestantism can lead to some very... Well, that's that wiccanry we talked about, taken to its logical extreme. But at the same time, you also wind up with that flowering, which, as you say, persists for a bit before, of course, then that more mechanistic side of things winds up going the other way. Now, the big thing that happens in the 1700s is, as you've sort of subtly alluded to, it's that capitalist transition. Now, the fact of the matter is that as soon as I say capitalism is a big part of the problem, especially because I earlier mentioned in not entirely unfavourable terms Mr. Marx, people will occasionally get out of arms and say, this must mean you're X, Y, and Z, and all sorts of opprobristic terms. This does not mean that at all. What it means is we can agree about the problem without necessarily endorsing some of the solutions or partial solutions that have been proposed at various points in more recent times, or in fact prior to that. But in terms, especially in the American sphere, it's most peculiar. They wind up with some people who are just fixated upon free markets and capitalism. They insist that Indo-European religion should have almost anarchic free markets and capitalism baked in. And when you point out that, say, the Bronze Age palace economy is a very command-oriented economy, they get very annoyed about it indeed, but I digress. The point is, what we find in this capitalistic sort of sphere, as compared to, say, the feudalistic sphere of several centuries beforehand, is this less of an organic, sort of, I suppose you could call it corporatist understanding. Instead of a man being, sort of even in some of the feudal times, a man, part of a great sort of chain of being, and a person who has sort of an intrinsic spark of, maybe not divinity, but intrinsic spark of worth in himself, often with a lot more leisure time than later people would have, you wind up with this person basically just being a substitute for a unit of capital. In fact, that's partially why Marx refers to the book as capital, because, of course, labour is now being used as capital / being crowded out by capital, so on and so forth. So it's literally dehumanising. What this leads to, of course, is because there's this immense change in the economic base of the society in question, is it does lead to a change in superstructure, precisely because industrialization, thanks to sort of the cotton boom taking off, the Industrial Revolution, leads to massive population dislocation. You have people relocating from sort of the small villages where they and their ancestors had lived, and going to work in these dark satanic mills, which have worsening the quality of life in a number of senses, because they're working 60-hour days, often dying in the machinery, all these things like that. But the community that had previously been connected to, and an organic part of it, has become fundamentally dislocated. All those folkways they used to have, those folk customs, have also become dislocated. They're too tired to actually engage in half the stuff anyway, where they wind up having moved halfway across the country. And it just keeps on going from there. It just keeps piling up. Through the 1800s, new stuff happens that leads to further additions to that. And you also wind up, unfortunately, with, some, I suppose you might call them attempted reform movements, which can wind up doing more harm than good in some of these particular spheres. One example of this is, which is useful to sort of talk about, the British Dominion of India. Now, one reason why a lot of people out there in the Hindu sphere start looking very sideways when we talk about various words like Aryan and Indo-European is because they think they've been down this road before with people who look a bit like us talking about sort of notions of Aryan races and things, and that we're basically just trying to retread some of that colonial meta-narrative from the 1800s. And to be fair, there are some idiots out there who do exactly that. But the of course, not my narrative at all. But in terms of one of the guys who was quite instrumental in British imperial policy in India in the late 1800s, there's a guy called Lord Macaulay. Now, Lord Macaulay, I reference him for two reasons, one of which is his castigation of Lord Elphinstone Lord Ellenborough, I should say, after Lord Ellenborough had actually tried to do something positive for the Hindu sphere by, we'll leave that for another time. The point is, Lord Macaulay, in this castigation of Lord Ellenborough in Parliament, was doing this big thing trying to artificially distinguish between the Hindu religion which he could see in India and the classical religion which he claimed to sort of, to love. Like, he wrote the Lays of Ancient Rome, great poetry. People often know that famous line, of, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and his temples of his gods? It's a wonderful line. But in terms of his perception of actual, Roman and Greek religion, in order to say it was completely different from the Hindu sphere's living religion, he had to artificially sanitize it. He had to manufacture this completely false image of the Indo-European religion of the classical sphere so that it could be nothing like what he saw and was, wanted to be reviled by in India. So it's like when you see sort of British banks and stuff and British sort of treatment of Greek statues. We know that in antiquity, Greek temples, Greek statues were painted. They were quite lively. We also know the British don't like that. They have those bare marble things. In the 1800s, you actually had them scrubbing away residual paint traces on the statues they unearthed because they wanted that more sterile sense. As of course is sort of mentioned, it's too messy otherwise. So you wind up with the construction of an attempt to engage with the archaic folklore, with the archaic mythos, also being sterilized. It goes through this Victorian reimagining of a lot of things, which makes it so much more difficult to actually re-engage meaningfully with the truth of those particular spheres. It makes it more difficult.
So that's fascinating because exactly, I'm very interested in this whitewashing of Greek culture. I mention it a lot. So can you give me an example in the Hindu sphere of this whitewashing, if we can call it that? Yeah.
Well, that's partially the thing, is it didn't actually take very well over in our end of things. Although, to be fair, some examples that... yes, that's a good example. Okay, so something which happened, it's an interesting story of cultural sort of contact, you might say. In the 1800s, you had a bunch of what we call Neo-Vedanta movements. Now, my general rule of thumb is that when you see the prefix neo sort of attached to something, it can probably be translated as worse version of. So, Neoplatonism goes in some strange directions. For some Neoplatonists, others are quite good. But Neo-Vedanta, you can see how it sort of works as a sort of worse version of what had come before. Now, Arya Samaj annoys the hell out of me because they grew up in the 1800s. They were one of those, sort of Hindu reform movements that appear to have taken some inspiration in some regards from the Christian sphere that they, was quite prominent in India at the time as well. Side issue. In terms of what they do, they wanted to sort of redefine, quite literally, a bunch of scriptural elements. So they go, oh yeah, the way that you guys have been reading these particular Vedic verses is obviously completely wrong. It must be some British conspiracy to make us look bad in front of the white people. Now, this is, I'm summarizing and paraphrasing, but that's basically it. So an example of this, which sort of shows up, is they don't believe that animal sacrifice was ever a thing in Hinduism. Now, we know for a fact this is completely and utterly wrong. We've got the archaeological materials, we've got the scriptural materials, we've got the comparative Indo-European theological materials. But they insist upon, in a particular, now it's a second mandala hymnal, I can't remember the exact number, but one particular hymnal which has the liturgy for this, which is describing what's happening with the horse that's being sacrificed. They insist instead on translating it as, oh yes, it's about good digestion. It's about giving the guy, who's carrying out the stuff, good digestion. It's not about a horse being, sort of sent off to heaven by having its throat slit or anything like that. That's one example of the whitewashing which can sort of take place. Another example,
in the Rigveda, I remember, the burial rite for the god Agni, who is given a goat to eat, i.e. burn, so that he doesn't eat the body, just roasts it, prepares it for heaven. So there's another example of a hymnal reference to some kind of animal sacrifice. Yes.
That is actually quite interesting. I have some thoughts on that, which I'll probably wind up writing an article upon. What happens? I want sort of things sparking off. Yes, Agni actually has two faces. It happens the devouring Kravya sort of face of things, which is carnivorous. There's the cognate Kravya, carnivorous, and of course the other one, which is more sort of acts in a psychopomp sort of role to actually take the deceased person up to heaven as a sort of a that's the. What, as you say, you're propitiating the dark side so that the light side can, in fact, be do what it's supposed to do. But anyway, in terms of examples of this whitewashing thing, you also wind up with sort of an enforced Victorian prudishness, we might say, when it comes to other elements of scripture. Now, Rigveda Mandala, Mandala 10, hymnal 86. It's an interesting hymn for a number of reasons. I cite it for, it seems to come up every interview I do. The main reason why I cite it is because it talks about Indra, and it talks about a figure called Vrishakapi. Vrishakapi is the monkey-headed god, otherwise known in more contemporary Hinduism as Hanuman. Hanuman, there's a bunch of mythological elements we could spend quite some time on, but effectively we can say strong concordance with Indra and the Indo-European striker/thunderer deific. So this figure that's often pointed to as a non-Indo-European deity, no, actually is rather prominently, is stated to be directly concordant with Indra in this particular Rigvedic hymnal, going right the way back to the archaic roots of Vedic civilization. And then there's a brief mention for Thor in the Grimnismal, allegedly, as a curious ape. Literally the word is ape, but I digress. In terms of RV 86, now, sorry, X86 I should say, you mentioned Tom Rosell survived the jive earlier. There was a Twitter thread back when he was still active on that particular platform, about 2 years ago or thereabouts. And he quoted a modern translation of certain relevant verses of this particular hymnal. Now, what he meant by it was, okay, so this is pretty, pretty lurid, pretty direct. And he said this was a healthy approach to sexuality because the Puvel translation, which I think was what he was quoting, effectively has something about the goddess in question is talking to her husband. So Indrani is talking to Indra, and she's saying that she is just the most well lubricated and the most vigorously counter thrusting. You can see it. Well, I don't need to unpack exactly what that means. It's a very directly sort of sexual thing. Now, he quoted this on Twitter, and immediately he was beset upon by an army of outraged people who insisted point blank that he was defaming the religion, defaming the gods by presenting this particular translation, and obviously it was some scurrilous, British conspiracy to make us look bad and uncivilized, and so on and so forth. So what did he do? I suppose he called in me to sort of explain things and check the translation. So we did. I made sure that I was consulting with my proper Brahminical associates in India to make sure we were getting it right. And we worked through word by word to show how this Puvel translation was broadly speaking, like there was a slight, I forget which, there was some element which was not quite, it had become quite a bit figurative, but generally, broadly speaking, it was exactly accurate and exactly accurate in its explicitness. But see, what then happened was these Twitter accounts, I understand where they're coming from. We often have people trying to attack the religion as being, you guys are a bunch of, I suppose you could say almost sort of...
heathens.
Well, heathen would possibly be a compliment in that particular regard, but it's more the sort of, you're worshipping genitalia,
dirty,
that sort of thing. I mean, yes. And technically speaking, you can interpret a lingam as that, but it's one interpretation amidst many. We can get into that some other time. But the point is, they're often trying to attack us, savage and uncivilized for these sorts of things, as Macaulay himself did, literally with that lingam sort of situation mentioned beforehand. So I understand where they're coming from, but the trouble is, when I was engaging with these guys, I basically said, okay, so this is the, here's the word-by-word translation. How would you translate it because you're insisting my word-by-word translation is inaccurate? Fair question. And what they'd respond with, when they weren't just sort of auto-blocking me, was they whipped out the Griffith translation. Now, Griffith is a famous translator of the Rigveda and a number of other things. He did his work in the late 1890s. He gets a lot of stick for a number of reasons, but I personally think he was actually pretty good at what he did. In fact, I prefer his translation a lot of the time to the more recent Jamison Brereton Oxford edition, although, anyway, side issue. The point is, he's a Victorian Englishman. And this means that, I'll actually, if you just give me a minute, I'll bring up the actual translation which he sort of rendered, because it is quite different in terms of how it actually sort of comes across. Where are we? Okay, here we are. All right, so the relevant verses which which we have sort of approached via the Purville version as being that thing about being sort of vigorously counter-thrusting and well lubricated. Mm-hmm. And I think actually there's a thing about being fair-asked as well, in terms of the rectum of the goddess in question. Understandable. In terms of how Griffith has translated, the line goes, "No dame hath ampler charms than I, or greater wealth of love's delights. None with more ardour offers with all her beauty to her lord's embrace. Supreme is Lord Indra over all." So as you can see, it's the same
Nothing
thing,
to do with, yeah.
but it's been translated in such a heavily bowdlerized version to not offend the sensibilities of the English reading public. The trouble we have in the Hindu sphere is some of these guys out there haven't actually engaged with the the archaic sort of text, especially in the original language, because it's very difficult to do. And therefore they assume that the post-Victorian version that we've got is therefore the actual accurate thing, and people presenting the proper, true, and accurate version are out to make things look stupid, a figure of fun, rather than present it accurately. So that's an example of the whitewashing that's gone on in the Hindu sphere. But what I actually wanted to sort of mention in terms of these sorts of exercises of whitewashing, etc., was another side of what Macaulay did. Now, Macaulay, some decades after this speech he gave in the British Parliament, attacking all of this, the Brahmanical religion as being nothing like the ancient Greece and Rome, which he apparently had a strange idea about, he became the guy effectively responsible for educational reform in India. So Macaulayism is basically, I call it civilizational vandalism, because that's literally what it was. He went, okay, so these, the natives are restless, or restive, I should say. After the rebellion in 1857, they still think of themselves as a different people. They still think of themselves as, sort of being independent in that regard. We want to turn them into basically just browner Englishmen. So what he did to actually make that happen was he carried out a number of legal attacks, if you will, against the traditional education vectors, the traditional cultural vectors, which took place in traditional sort of Hindu society, and it's still been going strong, even despite the Mughals and other sort of stuff like that, into the 1800s. This attempted to strike at the heart of what it was to be Hindu and roll out literally Jane Austen in its place. This is literally why Jane Austen is taught in English literature, because that was the text the English went for, okay, how do we replace these traditional epics with something that will make them more English? So we've got Macaulay to blame for all of that. What I suspect has actually sort of somewhat happened, it didn't work in India because the culture was so heavily intrinsically and endogenously Hindu for the Hindu sphere that it could not be displaced. There were big sort of protest movements against it, which comprised not necessarily going, okay, well, we're not going to go to these schools or whatever, but by organizing sort of, you might almost call it sort of Sunday school style tuition to ensure that various stuff still got passed down. There was a huge effort to preserve the culture even in spite of this. Meanwhile, over in the sort of the Anglosphere, over in the sort of the Western European sphere, what we have is a situation whereby the stories that are being told aren't the ones that are sort of the resonant ones of sort of archaic myth. You do wind up with the classical myths being a great foundation as the English are moving into the 1800s. So you get Lord Byron, for example, thinking of himself as almost a Homeric hero in terms of why he then went off to decide to fight the Turks personally, and that's a great and a wonderful thing. But after that, as we start moving into the 20th century, the narratives have become displaced. Instead of these great archaic and true story, well, true in a certain sense, mythic truth, we wind up with other narratives in their place. Part of this is understandable because, of course, the material conditions have changed, and therefore other narratives like, I suppose The Great Gatsby or something, wind up being deployed to actually talk about and act as commentary upon the new conditions which they found themselves in. However, moving into the 20th and 21st centuries, what we now see is this big effort to displace say, the classics from academia as one particular sort of example, because allegedly these stories aren't relevant to modern audiences. You find the same thing uttered by every high school student in an English class, and I must put my hand up and say that unfortunately I was one of them once. I recognised... I actually went back in my late 20s on my high school English teacher's last day to apologise to him in person. I said, "Sir, you were completely correct and I was wrong. Shakespeare is relevant, but I digress. The point is... the idea that these archaic stories aren't relevant is being seeded deliberately to break our connection with them. Modernity is re-entrenching itself by cutting off our vector of escape, to bring it back to that Tolkien thing. Those stories, they're our escape rope. They're our way of actually getting back to what's true and reclaiming the fact that we are human. You cut off those stories, you cut off the support, you lead to a demoralization, both in terms of morale and also in terms of morals. All that is left after that is a much more malleable figure who will consume whatever it is that you happen to sort of put in front of them, because, as you said at the start of things, they're so desperate for meaning. Now, I don't know if there's some sort of deliberate effort underpinning a lot of this sort of stuff, like Macaulay tried to do in India. I do know that when it comes to actually looking at how these things manifest in practice, it definitely appears to be a very concerted sort of thing. The issue that we have is that when we start cutting out the classical sphere, or indeed any of these other archaic spheres, we're losing not only our heritage directly. Cornel West, great American thinker. Now, he's black. Many people sort of may or may not know of him, but he was a great exponent of the classical sort of paradigm. And when this big sort of movement in America about ending sort of classical studies in its exalted position in academia because it's really white, apparently, when this sort of really got going, he actually spoke against it. He said, "Now hold the phone. When I was engaging with all the these classical philosophers and thinkers and writers, I was engaging with the best minds of the past 3,000 years. What you guys are trying to do, when you say that there's nothing of relevancy here for black kids or anybody else for that matter, you are cutting off their chance to engage with some of the best minds that humanity has ever produced." That does not sound like empowerment. You know what I mean? It's a wonderful sort of sentiment. But in terms of I have a quote which I sort of will read out, which does come from sort of antiquity in this particular regard. Now, I'm a great fan of Aristophanes. In sixth form, I could have done math. Well, I failed fifth form maths once, or twice, as the case may be. I argued my way out of doing sixth form maths and into doing seventh form classics a year ahead. I later wound up, sort of passing a scholarship exam with it. It's partially how I wound up at university with a scholarship in classical studies. My favourite part of that entire milieu would have to be Aristophanes. I was therefore very disappointed to find he sort of didn't get quite as much acknowledgement when I was in Athens more than a decade ago as some other figures. But in terms of the wasps, is it the wasps they're referencing? Yes, it is. It's a situation whereby, I won't go into detail about the actual sort of nature of the play, but the quote goes from the chorus, "In days when men were men, and you should have seen us then. We were noted for our vigour and our agility. We carried all before us, both in battle and as chorus, and no one could have questioned our virility. Those days, alas, are gone, and the feathers of the swan are no whiter than our hair, for we are old. And yet, as you can see, feeble relics though we be, in spirit we're still manly, young and bold. Yes, we may be poor old crocs, but the whiteness of our locks does the city better credit, I would say, than the ringlets and the fashions, and the pederastic passions of the namby-pamby youngsters of today." It's a great quote. And in terms of what we're trying to actually get across here, that's effectively it. We've wound up with the perception that these archaic elements of heritage aren't ours, that they're so far removed from us, they may as well be, sort of alien people who just happen to look a bit like us and happen to sort of maybe share some of our names and things. This distancing has become a matter both of, sort of policy for some people for various reasons, but also a simple matter of consequence because we're so innovated by, modern life and those unnatural ways of living that we don't have the mental energy or ethos to engage with this more traditional sphere. It's one of those things that, sort of to briefly, one of those things I like about the Hindu sphere is that the supernal sphere is not just alive in the sense that you go to a temple, sort of 2 or 3 times a week. It's alive all around you. The people know the epics. The people will quote the epics. The people see resonances for themselves in these archaic texts. They will, sort of invoke things on a daily basis. They haven't got that situation whereby, to anything like the same extent, whereby it's an alien sphere that has become divorced from them. I suppose in terms of that Gnostic typology, which you talked about earlier with regard to Tolkien, this is the issue we have. In fact, this is why a Gnostic typology is fundamentally one that can go very haywire for us, precisely because it draws a hard border often. It's difficult to generalize about the Gnostic sphere, as I'm sure you know, but it often draws a hard border between the material world that we inhabit and the divine realm, the pleroma, the world of the spirit. The actual Indo-European approach to these sorts of things doesn't really seem to have quite such of a barrier like that. So that mind-spirit dualism, I suppose that's the Cartesian dualism, since you brought up Descartes earlier, is something that we do have to overcome. Because while you are absolutely correct that there is a degree, well, not just degree of distinction, a distinction between the sort of the spirit and sort of the vehicle for the spirit, the world around us which this vehicle traverses is one which has divinity to it, which is, you need to know how to see it. Now, as an example, one of my favourite bits of the Iliad, it's in Book 5. It's where Diomedes is about to carry out his particular, very sort of epic series of deeds, the one in which he literally fights off several gods and lives to tell the tale, with capacious divine assistance, of course, from Varchdevi, that is to say Athena. The way in which he's able to do this is Athena appears to, of course, her chosen, and she says, okay, right, I'm going to lift the veil of sort of the mists from your eyes so that you may see the world as it actually is. And of course, then we see these coruscating sort of beams of fire coming from his helmet, from his shield. It's almost like a third eye understanding, especially because he can see things as they actually are. And this includes being able to see those gods aforementioned on the battlefield around him. That is what we are trying to get back to. A sense whereby, even without Athena herself turning up to go, right, tweak, I'm going to sort of unlock things so that you can see things properly, we're able to see these things sort of around us even so. Vakam garjat lakshanam. Vakam, it's, or vacham I should say, is once again cognate with voice, vox, so on and so forth. So voice, garjat, effectively, garjana is from a term which means thunder. I forget what the cognates are, although I know crows and the sort of the black bird, also my name, funnily enough, is a cognate with it. But it can also mean roaring, sort of indistinct speech, you might say. Elephant sort of bellowing and stuff. Lakshanam means bearing the imprintings of, bearing the markings, the characteristics of. Vacham garjat lakshanam, therefore, what it effectively means is thunder bearing the characteristics of divine speech. Or, phrased another way, indistinct speech, that rumbling noise, bearing the imprintings of that sort of supernal element. So when we hear thunder, the situation that we have is that people will hear it as a meteorological phenomenon. They'll go, okay, so there's a static discharge of electricity. They won't hear the laughter of the divine within it, and they've lost something fundamental, something human about that as a result. C.S. Lewis, and it turns up also in Pratchett, wonderful man, and both of them wonderful men. Actually, there's a bit, once again, from that novel Hogfather, which I've just sort of quoted previously, talking about handing over a sword to a child as an important lesson. Because that novel is about somebody trying to assassinate the fantasy setting in question's Santa Claus figure, and in so doing, disenchant the world. It's a wonderful metaphor. But in terms of, he doesn't win. Admittedly, a lot of hijinks have to be pulled off in order to ensure this, including somebody taking up the mantle of Santa Claus in order to sort of keep the myth going. But in terms of him
that's in which novel is that?
The novel is Hogfather. It's
Hogfather.
Basically not a satire, but a sort of an exploration, if you will, of Christmas and myth and a bunch of stuff like that. It's a wonderful novel. But in terms of what happens after the assassination attempt is thwarted, the sort of the figure that's sort of playing this, Death, who's sort of a narrative voice, you might sort of say, is asked the question, okay, so what if we hadn't won? What if this had all sort of gone ahead? What if, effectively, myth had been killed via this particular sort of act? And Death responds that, Death is asked quite directly, surely the sun would have still risen tomorrow if we hadn't won. And Death says, no, it wouldn't have. And they're like, well, hold on, why wouldn't have? I mean, how does this work? And he said, a ball of flaming gas would have illuminated the world. That's all. It's not the sun. Because all the stuff that we attach to the sun is so much greater, so much grander, in terms of the meaning we ascribe to it. The solar sort of hero archetype we often hear about, the solar source and origin of so much life and empowerment, the thing that dispels the darkness, the thing that is the great comfort. We see the sun peeking through dark clouds. All of those metaphorical understandings, all of those narrative understandings, those mythic understandings, would have gone out the window. So you wind up, effectively, with a completely mythless man who could only perceive the sun as being, some thermonuclear reaction that's a ball of flaming gas. It doesn't have anything like the same resonancy. It doesn't enchant our world. It doesn't lend beauty to our world in anything like the idea of the sun, the idea of the stars. You get what I mean about that. It becomes non-human. It becomes fundamentally and foundationally robotic.
It becomes an it rather than a thou, we might say. Just bringing it on to today, these feelings of displacement, as you said, and disenchantment, they're very alive, and unfortunately they're very, very unguided. You mentioned these people attacking Tom Rousseau, perhaps yourself, and I get some of these quotes. Again, you can't win with mentioning Indo-Europeans. You have the politically correct crowd that will just say, "Oh, it's essentially a Nazi myth," and you have on the other side the admirers of Indo-Europeans who are going to say, "You got it wrong, because Indo-Europeans were always noble people. They were noble people until their blood got thinner, but intermixing with whatever, but." It's that second crowd that I feel more for, because they don't seem to have an agenda, unlike the leftist crowd, They just have this passion for reconnection. And, there's a book out there called The Bronze Age Mindset, which I think spoke to these people. And I have to say I admire this book. It's to be taken with a grain of salt, as the English say. There's a lot there that is not to be taken literally. You should not emulate Cortez by pillaging and raping, but there is something to the idea that all these old figures that were once considered heroic are now considered as very evil, and statues of them should be torn down, and Columbus himself should be torn down, etc., etc. There's something decadent in that, I believe, and that Bronze Age mindset capture that. But it's the crowd that I'm most interested in talking to, these young, when people find you with all these passions that are very misguided. What do you do to kind of clarify and bring this idea of an Indo-European tradition in a healthy way to focus?
Well, we take it slowly is probably the best way of answering that question. I mean, yeah, I completely get what you're sort of saying about that. In terms of that second crowd, it's something that I continually find myself having to emphasize, is that when you look, if you're going to be racist about things, you should be properly racist. Now, the trouble is that as soon as you start being properly racist about things and actually looking at the archaeogenic evidence, the racism that, I suppose the conventional racism that some of these guys are often quite keen to espouse about a white race and, other sorts of narratives starts falling apart. Because you wind up with the thought-terminating cliche that I sort of adopt upon occasion is, if you're going to go by strict patrilineal descent, because these people are often quite patriarchal, then you wind up with many Iranians being white, because they got R1A sort of Y-DNA haplogroups, and many Finns not being white because they have N sort of type haplogroups from somewhere in Inner Mongolia. That's if you take that as being your rubric for what is versus isn't white, and if you think white is actually a useful category in the first place, which I really don't know about that. That's another conversation for another time. I mean, in terms of the sort of the genetic side of stuff, what we actually see is a situation whereby modern myths have taken roots in a fashion that has become quite a barrier for people to actually engage with what's really there. We talked a bit about this in terms of the the pre-interview sort of conversation when it comes to the feminist historiography that took root post sort of Gumbuta, saying, oh yes, the Indo-Europeans were completely patriarchal, they had warlike male sky gods, and the pre-Indo-European cultures of old Europe and so forth were, they worshipped a great mother goddess, and they were matriarchal in utopia, and so on and so forth. Now, the first thing to be said is that this is a very powerful story. People want to believe in it, especially because it has implications for today. Unfortunately, it's not true. We can demonstrate this first up archaeologically. I was reading a rather interesting paper, which I can go and find the name of in a moment, about deconstructing the archaeology and showing how it has been bad archaeology and sort of misreading things almost deliberately to get to the point of this great goddess thesis being an idea in the first place. But also, second, we can just run it quite straightforwardly in terms of the actual Indo-European cultures and the reconstruction of power that we have. The foremost war goddess in any given, the foremost war deity, we should say, in many Indo-European pantheons tends to be a goddess. You got Athena over here, okay, exhibit A, Durga over here in the sort of the Hindu sphere, and the examples just keep on piling up of these very indomitable female figures that don't get conquered. They do the conquering. But the problem is that doesn't fit the narrative, because effectively what we have is a certain sort of, as we said, misogynist and a certain sort of feminist both want to believe that prehistory was a case of patriarchal Indo-Europeans with patriarchal religion rolling over the top of matriarchal and sort of divine feminine pre-Indo-Europeans, whereas in fact it appears much more equal opportunity, insofar as the Proto-Indo-Europeans appear to have had very much sky goddesses as well as sky gods, and amongst the foremost of these sky imperialists, we might say, were of course those goddess figures. But it doesn't fit the narrative, neither side wants to claim it, so it's left to guys like me to point it out. But in terms of going to the genetic side of it, what we wind up with is a much more complex picture than, sort of the Hitlerian sort of approach would have, as of course anybody should logically assume. So, the Yamnaya culture, assuming for the moment that Yamnaya are in fact Proto-Indo-Europeans, there's a bit of up in the air about whether it's the Yamnaya or a slightly north of them but sort of related group, more for another time. Basically, they encounter the corded ware culture, what becomes the corded ware culture, and sort of a combination sort of thing gets going. You could say that in terms of how this spread and diffusion of Indo-European genes and heritage seems to take place, miscegenation almost appears to be an archaic Indo-European trope that just keeps sort of happening. And then, of course, in terms of the northern expansion, the part that I bring this up particularly because of, is you wind up with likely a more sort of bellicose encounter with the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of Scandinavia. The issue is, while there appears to have been a war, it's one the Indo-Europeans didn't win. Now, I always get this wrong. I think it's I2, the Y-DNA haplogroup. It might be I1. I'll have to check that, so somebody may call me up in the comments, especially if STJ's out there. But in terms of what we wind up seeing, pre-Indo-European, invasion of this particular area, you have so quite a dominant sort of role for this particular non-Indo-European haplogroup. Then the Indo-Europeans show up, and you start seeing the R1A, Y-DNA show up, etc., except they don't show up in the position you'd expect of a victorious conquering people. They show up in the ordinary burials. The I2, etc., are still there in the nobility burials, so evidently they didn't lose. They did wind up Indo-Europeanized, however, of course, so interesting how that might have obviously sort of taken place, or unobviously I should say. But the reason why it makes such a point of this is because when you actually start looking at the situation of the Nordic Indo-European Bronze Age, you in fact find that people talking about Nordic Indo-Europeans as being some sort of pure Proto-Indo-European race does not work out at all, because you have such a significant quotient of the Y-DNA that is, as one particular element, there's other bits and pieces we can talk about, as being non-Indo-European, but it gets assimilated into the Indo-European sphere. So by the time that, forget how many thousand years later, about 2,000 years later or thereabouts, you wind up with the Germanic migrations into England. The fact that you have I2, etc., sort of haplogroups showing up in England doesn't mean, oh, hey, non-Indo-Europeans are showing up. It means, yes, Germanic Indo-Europeans who happen to have this originally far back non-Indo-European Y-DNA haplogroup that is now Indo-European are indeed migrating. It's assimilation. So, as I say, if you want to do the racism thing properly, it quite rapidly leads you to a position whereby we don't wind up with the narratives they want to believe in being quite accurate, especially when you consider the level of EMBA, early middle Bronze Age steppe DNA in various Indian populations, including South Indian populations who are Dravidian, even some tribal populations as it happens. Various of these groups actually have comparable EMBA steppe, basically Proto-Indo-European autosomal DNA quotient, to various Western European populations. The narrative of, the Indians are sort of, mixed, degenerated, so on and so forth because they're browner, doesn't actually track, because of course also Western Europeans are mixed as well, and often you wind up with a similar genetic line that can be observed. I digress. The point is, what we must emphasize is that expression that sort of often turns up. It's not biblically based, but it's a nice expression. That the water of the covenant is thicker than the blood of the womb. In this particular regard, who is more Indo-European, really? Those guys over there in the Hindu sphere, say, sort of one of my associates is a Bharadvaja. He's a Brahmin from an ancient, Rishi lineage. We literally use his ancestors' hymnals today. You can trace things back basically sort of 3,500, 4,000 years. It's an incredible ancestry. In fact, he's one of the ones in question is actually quite a fan of genetic testing. And he actually, one of his relatives to his ancestral line, they fished out of a peat bog in the Ukraine, having been preserved several millennia ago. I digress. The point is, those Brahmins over there, with, as we say, a reasonable EMBA sort of step genetic quotient, whatever, if that means something. But, okay, yep, sure, they're browner of complexion. But they're still immersed in their ancestral culture. They have an unbroken line of initiation running right back to, the Rigveda 4,000 years ago, likely even further back to the Ur-Yamat itself. Who's more Indo-European? Them, or some guy over in sort of America? I shouldn't pick on the Americans. There's some good Americans out there. Somewhere in the Western European sphere, who goes, yes, I am part of the Aryan nation. And because I have the sort of a lighter sort of complexion with the sort of hair and eyes, etc., that means I am more Aryan than these people who are literally Arya over here. And by the way, Christianity is an Aryan religion, not like Dravidian Hinduism. I say that particular last bit because a few days ago I literally ran into somebody trying to claim that, and it was a very, very peculiar engagement indeed. Now, in terms of... So the first thing we do is we set out the information, probably a lot more succinctly than I just did there. We deconstruct the worldview. We show how, on a scientific basis, various elements of it that are coming to us from a pseudo-scientific sort of standpoint aren't that legitimate. We show how, in fact, there is this coterminity that can be explored on a scientific basis if that's what you view to be meaningful. Personally, I think that it's a sort of a misdirection to get too far into the archaeogenetics for obvious sorts of reasons. I view the heritage element as being much more in terms of the culture, the religion, the language, the stuff that makes us human, rather than necessarily just bearers of an X chromosome and a Y chromosome and stuff of that particular nature. So, in terms of that side of stuff, that's why we carry out the detailed theological analysis to show that actually all the stuff over here in the Hindu sphere that people are talking about as being degenerated, Dravidian, whatever, is not. It is in fact strongly concordant with stuff that we see over in the Western European sphere, and by the way, a lot of the stuff that is in the Dravidian sphere, so-called, is actually pretty, sort of strongly resonant, congruent with it, etc., including often being much more conservative than some of the northern sort of Hindu stuff, precisely because they didn't have the Muslim sort of hordes ravine through and suppressing a whole bunch of stuff, so therefore it gets continued on sort of down the line. So, we set out the facts. We slowly and we patiently engage with people both on that sort of SJW liberal side of things and also that more sort of other side of things, because frankly everybody from any end of the political spectrum can have the wrong end of the stick about this in all directions. Now, in terms of one article I wrote about a year ago that was talking about the position of women in archaic Indo-European culture and mythology, I got it in both ends. I had some guy sort of write and basically say he didn't care what sort of archaic myth said or scripture, etc. According to Evola or something, warfare had to be an exclusively masculine pursuit, so therefore I was a feminist step revisionist for pointing out here's the archaeological remains which show completely differently, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, exactly the same article, I had somebody else claiming that I was a fascist who was glorifying warfare and all these other things which went along, so I got it on both ends. So in terms of that, I wrote a response which basically went, look guys, it isn't about being a feminist or about being an anti-feminist. Those are modern terms. What we're doing, if you could, I suppose, if you insist upon phrasing it in modern terms, we are being anti-feminist, which is to say a priori to feminism as a modern thing. In some areas, sure, it may sort of comport reasonably sort of strongly with some feminist constructions. In other areas, it almost certainly doesn't. But see, that's the thing. We don't allow ourselves to be defined by the narrow sort of political blinkered perspective stuff that people often have when they come to us trying to engage in this sphere. We make friends with everybody.
And drawing into a close, I guess, where do we find you now to talk about your organization, your task, and what you're trying to achieve there? Yeah,
the easiest way to sort of find us is probably on social media. I know it can often be referred to as a bit of a hellscape, but we try and make active good use of it, re-enchant the world via re-enchanting even that most demonic of places. But in terms of that, you can find Arya Akasha, I'll spell that for the non-Sanskrit speakers in the audience, Arya space Akasha. So, 2 words, quite simple. On Facebook, quite easily. You can also find us on our website, which is aryaakasha.com. So once again, ARYAAKASHA.com. A reasonable sort of Google should bring it up pretty sort of promptly. Generally speaking, the articles, which are often quite sort of lengthy, wind up going up, both places, but people find it easier to read on the website. We also have a YouTube channel, which I've been occasionally doing stuff with, effectively trying to sort of explain things more, either more succinctly or more sort of just off the top of my head, because people seem to like the more conversational style of engagement, we might sort of say. So the YouTube channel is, of course, also called Arya Akasha, reasonably easy to sort of remember in that sort of sense. The name, as a brief tangent in that particular regard, brief tangent on it, Arya is often misunderstood. People talk about an Aryan race. This is not a thing. I mean, it kind of is when it comes to the Iranian sphere, but that's a degeneration of it. It became a material term, if you will. The actual original sense of Arya is it's somebody who knows the proper things and does the proper things for their community. They're somebody who is part of their community, the Arya community. So in terms of those rights, which were sort of aforementioned and active, I suppose you could call it EU-social sort of behaviour. This is also partially why language is quite intrinsic to it, because you need to be able to speak the language in order to participate in the community, participate in the rights, and therefore the people who can't speak the language, barbarians, who might sort of say, to reference both that Greek term and that Sanskrit term, barbaras, which means exactly what you think it does. Anyway, it derives from Proto-Indo-European her, which effectively means to sort of to fit together, to join, and working with each other is, of course, sort of element of it, as, of course, is the the proper sort of custom, that rita element, which is similarly derived. So, proper sort of noble conduct, if you will, the ecclesiastical sphere, all those sorts of things. It became, in sort of, as I say, the degenerated sort of Iranic end of things. Iranic is, of course, from the same alternate root, an ethnonym, which is connotes belonging to an ethnos, but its original sense was simply belonging to an ethos, sort of that way of doing things, which we're trying to sort of rediscover and make available once again across the Indo-European sphere. The Akasha element, because of course Akasha is the fifth element, the sort of the astral, those sorts of sides of things, is because that Arya understanding, it's supernal. It never went away. It was just our ability to access and interface with it has become rather more difficult in this particular modern time. So that's why the name is there, because we're trying to enable reconnection with that proper way of doing things. There's nothing racial about it. I just thought I'd like to emphasize that. So find us on Facebook, on YouTube, and of course the website.
No, it's good. And before we go, just talking about this, what was your training that led you to this knowledge of Indo-Europeans, briefly speaking?
Being very angry about things being misrepresented, to put it bluntly. I mean, to brief sort of 50-second synopsis of it. Like, as I say, at high school, I excelled in sort of the more humanities end of stuff, so English literature and, as we mentioned, classical studies. Got to university, did a few bits and pieces in some directions adjacent to that, but most of my insight and stuff of that particular nature, what happened was I, as I say, wound up in the Hindu sphere. After a while, I think it was about a year or thereabouts, I wound up with that calling to start looking into it. And I wound up going out and trying to find books or other sources to help guide me on this, because I was like, well, this is huge. This is 5,000 years worth of stuff, and 5,000 kilometers either side. Too big for one man. Must have been a big area of academic interest previously. Now, what I started finding was, there wasn't very much that was modern. Because, as we've talked about, there's a bit of an academic sort of fear of engaging with that sphere, because it has some stigma attached to it for a number of reasons. B, a lot of the stuff that was available, both, either A, and this could be quite modern as well, talking about the Hindu sphere directly, or B, talking about Indo-European comparative bits and pieces, often seemed to be just blatantly inaccurate. It just wasn't so. Like, I'd compare this to the versions of the tales that I'd heard, the ways we carried out rites, sort of at temple, all the other stuff like that, and I went, this is describing something almost completely different. It's like these academics are just talking to themselves, and they're just reviewing other academics' works, rather than actually engaging with the primary religion or anything else like that. So I went, I'm going to have to work on that.
But still, like, at that point, you knew a few things about what was right and what was wrong.
Yeah.
Like, what was your initial turning point that kind of turned your mind's eye towards this field of Indo-European faith?
I see. Okay, well, in terms of knowing a few things and sort of, I suppose, being able to actually say this doesn't sound right, what effectively happened was, like, when I wound up coming to the religion in question, following some severely sort of tumultuous personal circumstances, we should say. It was a life or death situation. The death briefly triumphed, but not permanently. We wound up with, as I say, my adoptive family going, we're taking you to temple to sort your life out. And of course, lo and behold, it did. In addition to that sort of engagement directly sort of on a regular basis there, I also spent several months stationed at a Shaivite mandala in elsewhere in Auckland, working under the Nath lineage Acharyaji, they're Nepali, well, he was Nepali, the Nath sort of lineage is a bit of a broader thing, but it's basically a Shaivite temple where I was there daily for hours a day, working with them, helping them out, learning things, being taught things, and so that was where I acquired a lot of my understanding of ritual. I then wound up going from there into building upon it, precisely because it became, I had a lot more. See, when you're born into the sphere in question, you don't question things, and you often don't sort of, in various cases, take a lot of time and care to sort of understand things. You just do things because, that's the way they've always been done. I, came into it in later life and had a lot of catching up to do, which therefore meant that I had to work a lot harder to actually sort of, fill in the gaps in my knowledge, which therefore meant that my going around talking to experts, Brahmins, so on and so forth, and picking up this knowledge through either direct training, books, so on and so forth, meant that it became a lot more comprehensive than, I suppose, various other people who may have found themselves in a similar situation. And then we just wound up with one thing adding, leading to another. And eventually, before you know it, you got, I forget, like 7 years in or something. And because you wind up with just so much stuff that then reconfirms the other stuff, you gain this ability to see the patterns and the insight. Like, it's something which, being possibly a bit hubristic, like, my work has become predictive, if you will. Like, one anecdote on this, there's a figure called Parjanya. Now, Parjanya is a rain god, or rather a facing of a particular god who causes rainfall. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, you go to the broad sort of academic bits and pieces, they'll say, oh yeah, he's a form of Indra, which it makes kind of sense because Indra, thunder, one of the thunder gods.
Thunder, rain.
Yeah, it fits. But I said, now that doesn't sound right to me because I've looked at like these particular sort of hymnals. I've looked at sort of the reconstructive typology I've got in my head. This isn't an Indra facing. This should be a Darius Pittara facing. This should be a Skyfather facing. And, like, people went, no, it's, like, we appreciate you've done all this analysis of these various sorts of hymnals and you've made your case about the symbolism and so on and so forth. We don't agree. Just, because ex-academic said Y, and then I traced the chain of derivation on that. What it actually resulted from was some guy in the 1890s had come up with this idea of Parjanya being sort of a facing of Indra, partially based over, I think it might even be in a non-Indo-European thing he'd drawn in. It was inaccurate and on bad foundations, but it just had never gone seriously challenged. Anyway, I wrote an article on all of this, as of course I'm often want to do, and one of my Brahminical associates, a few months later, he hit me up and said, okay, so I thought you were on shaky ground with this, because, like, it's accepted wisdom. I was then reading through the Shatapada Brahmana, which is, sort of, it's a Vedic text, basically a ritual sort of manual, if you will. It has a lot of very interesting, useful stuff in it. In the course of his education, he was sort of engaging with the particular text, as of course he should. And he said, and lo and behold, I found this direct mention that was exactly what you predicted and exactly what you said about Parjanya being a facing of Diyas Pittara, and some other sort of supporting elements which went alongside that. This happens quite frequently. So in terms of, I suppose you might say...
Well, that's science. That's being scientific. The ability to create a model of reality that predicts new reality, essentially. Exactly.
But see, that's the thing. That's theology as a science. People often try and say theology is, it's just sort of narratives about, cool stories, if you will. The story is most definitely cool. That should never be in any doubt. But at the same time, the way in which we deploy theology in a serious sense, not only can we actually do this observed stuff, deductive, inductive, and demonstrate the truth of things with this approach. I could list many other examples. My work's done exactly the same thing. We also can apply it in other senses to the ritual side of stuff. Now, one example, which we should have touched on earlier, which I'll keep brief, Hindu astrology. Now, this is a fantastically complex subject. We won't get into any sort of details and sort of precise stuff in it. One of my associates is a pretty gifted Hindu astrologer. And, we were talking about all these sorts of stuff when I was having some work done on this particular front. And yeah, the way he was approaching things and the way, so the general Jyotisha community approached things wasn't, okay, well, we got all these ancient texts that we're just going to sort of apply stuff out of. It was also this actively under development sort of thing whereby they go, yep, we've observed these patterns for these people under these circumstances with, so this complex array of planets and various houses, so on and so forth. And these patterns over here, when they apply various, remedies to these sort of astrological features. Now, we can argue, of course, about how sound the empirical basis may be of various elements of it, but the point is, it's not simply, taking things on faith or going, well, we're just going to clap our hands if what we believe. It's an actual inductive, deductive, whatever you want to call it, process, which applies a pretty scientific approach, or at least the methods, sort of experientially derived stuff, in order to strengthen what we're actually doing as a living religious sphere.
Well, with that, I would love to thank you for participating in this conversation. We've been talking for a while. There's a lot of things to listen, re-listen, and understand, and for the audience. And I would definitely like to have a second one at some point, dive into different things, because it's such a multifaceted thing. For now, I'd love to thank you on behalf of our audience. Best of luck. May the gods be with you.
And thank you very much for having us.